To expect the same service from raw and undisciplined recruits as from veteran soldiers is to expect what never did and perhaps never will happen. Men who are familiarized to danger meet it without shrinking, whereas troops unused to service often apprehend danger where no danger is.
In the years of the American Revolution, General George Washington's Continental Army fights bravely and indeed valiantly for independence from Great Britain. But for all their fighting spirit, with the loss of New York City in 1776 and Philadelphia the following year, it soon becomes clear that a crucial piece is missing from the Patriots' battlefront. When Washington sees the power and mobility of horse-mounted soldiers and officers, he is merely reminded of tactics that have, to that point, been employed for centuries. Indeed, the shock and awe of the mobile, armored troop continues to be utilized on the battlefield, even today, as the horse is gradually replaced by the automobile, the tank, and defense aircraft. While cavalry and dragoons have been in use in Europe and Asia for hundreds of years, it is the American Revolution that serves as the birthplace and the start of an evolutionary journey for the United States Cavalry.
Cavalry, a four-footed blitzkrieg, fast-moving, hard-hitting. The idea then was get the fastest means available of moving over varied terrain and build a fighting unit around that mobility. Times change, but today the idea is exactly the same. Only now the cavalry moves on the wind, and the saddle trooper has become the sky trooper. Air Mobile is the military word for such a unit, and the Army's first such combat division is now in being. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. The new first team.
Around 350 BC, the Greek historian, soldier, and mercenary Xenophon writes perhaps some of the earliest works detailing the command of cavalry and the use and care of horses. Born in Athens, but identifying with Sparta for most of his life, Xenophon is a student of Socrates and spends a great deal of time fighting with mercenaries led by Cyrus against the Persians. His account of the battles, like the Battle of Cunaxa that saw Cyrus perish on the battlefield, and the journey home, forms the foundation of his history, Anabasis. Xenophon also went on to write a comprehensive, if not romantic, biography of Cyrus the Great himself, the Cyropedia. His work, the Hellenica, is a source many historians refer to as the most accurate account of the years in Greece from 411 to 362 BC, continuing the history begun by Thucydides in that author's History of the Peloponnesian War. One of few authors from his time period whose entire body of work was preserved intact, Xenophon's writing covers a number of topics and genres, including histories, biographies, Socratic dialogues and apologies, and most importantly, manuals for the hunter, soldier, and horseman. Xenophon draws on his experiences as a soldier and cavalryman in his work Hipparchus, or the duties of a cavalry commander.
First of all, it is incumbent on you to offer sacrifice and to entreat the gods to grant you to think and say and do those things by which you may exercise your command most agreeably to them, and with the greatest pleasure and honor and benefit to yourself, your friends, and your country. When the gods are propitiated, you must prepare your cavalry, taking care that the number prescribed by law may be completed, and that the force previously enrolled may not be diminished. For unless new horsemen are added, the number will constantly grow less, as some must retire from old age, and some must fail from other causes. After the complement is made up, you must take care that the horses may be fed in such a way as to be able to endure exertion. For horses that are too weak for their work will be unable either to overtake an enemy or to retreat. You must make it an object of your attention, too, that they may be fit for service, for such as are unmanageable are an aid to the enemy rather than to their friends. Such as kick when they are mounted also must be set aside, for they often inflict more mischief on their own side than the enemy inflict. You must pay attention to their feet also, that they may be in a condition to be ridden even on rough ground, knowing that when they suffer from being ridden, they become useless. When you have your horses in proper condition, you must next exercise your men. In the first place, that they may be well able to vault on their horses, for by that means safety has been secured by many. And in the second, that they may be qualified to ride over every kind of ground, as the enemy will be at different times in different places. When they are able to sit firm, you must see that they exercise themselves as much as possible in throwing javelins on horseback, and that they qualify themselves to do everything that cavalry ought to do.
In that same year, 350 BC, Xenophon sets down his rules of horsemanship and essentials for the soldier on horseback in his short treatise on horsemanship.
I wish also to set down how the man who is to run the hazard of battle on horseback should be armed. To begin with the cuirass, this must always be made to fit the body, for if it fits well, the body supports its weight. But if it is very loose, the shoulders have to carry it all by themselves. As for too tight a cuirass, it is a straitjacket, and not a piece of armor. For a helmet, the Boeotian is the best, in my opinion, since it most completely protects all the parts that are above the cuirass, without preventing you from seeing. Now, as the rider himself is in extreme danger if anything happens to his horse, the animal also should be armed with a frontlet, breastplate, and thigh pieces. The last serve at the same time to cover the thighs of the rider. For offensive, I recommend the saber rather than the sword. For the rider being aloft, a scimitar blow will be more in place than the thrust of a sword. Instead of a spear of scantling, which is weak and clumsy to carry, I am inclined to recommend 2 javelins made of cornel wood. A skillful person can throw one and then use the other in front, on the flank, or in the rear. They are also stronger than the spear and handier to carry.
Throughout the ages, many cultures make use of horses in warfare. Early nomadic Central Asian peoples utilized cavalry in constant conflict among the many other tribes in their area, most famously in the Mongol conquest over most of the Eurasian continent. Muslim warriors in North Africa, Asia, and Europe during the 7th and 8th centuries also make use of light cavalry in their campaigns throughout those regions. The Middle Ages saw European knights become the ultimate heavy cavalry, as armored men and their sometimes armored horses ride into battle as England, France, Germany, Spain, and other countries fight over territory, and later as the Roman Catholic Church mounts the Crusades from about AD 1096 through 1291. Long after the Crusades, conflict over territory continues, as United States Cavalryman Lieutenant Colonel George T. Dennison writes in his 1868 book, Modern Cavalry, in which he gives a brief history of cavalry in 1500s Europe.
Prince Alexander of Parma, when in 1552 he wished to surprise the Duke of Alençon, mounted several companies of infantry on pack horses, and thus hastened towards the enemy. This was the first instance of the employment of that force, and shortly afterwards it became customary to mount large bodies of infantry in order to move them quickly upon the decisive points, until at length dragoons came to form a portion of every army. Now that firearms are so much more deadly than heretofore, so much the greater advantage will be derived from the employment of mounted men trained to fight on foot with these new weapons.
It would be the combined strength of firepower, manpower, and horsepower that would lead to victory for a country of rebels over 200 years later.
The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and themselves consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us only the choice of brave resistance or the most abject submission. We have, therefore, to resolve to conquer or die.
On April 14th, 1775, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America, receives instructions to disarm and arrest American revolutionaries, their leaders, and militiamen. Just 2 months previous, Britain had declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion. Commanding British regulars from Boston, Gage sends 700 soldiers to Concord in an effort to seize the stockpiled ammunition and weapons from the colonial militia. This is the night of April 18th, 1775, which will be made famous by the ride of Paul Revere. Revere and other men on horseback race across the Massachusetts countryside through the night, warning citizens and militia alike of the impending British attack. As the morning of April 19th comes, 77 Minutemen attempt to defend Concord's village green from the British, but their ranks are thin, and the British, killing several Minutemen, move through this initial line into Concord proper. There, the British find a force of 500 Minutemen and are forced to retreat to Boston. The road back to their base of operations is fraught with volley fire at every turn, as the British are attacked by thousands of militiamen from various villages along the route. The message to both sides was clear. The war was on. In the first year of the American Revolution, the colonials fight bravely, using tactics wholly unfamiliar to the British redcoats, and making the most of their intricate knowledge of the land they had come to call their home. However, by the following year, it becomes apparent to General Washington that resources and tactics have provided Britain with a certain edge on the battlefield. While there were a few mounted regiments, they were not nearly enough to match forces with the British dragoons. In their History of the Armor Cavalry, published in 1969, Mary Lee Stubbs and Stanley Russell Connor encapsulate the evolution of the United States Cavalry that began with the American Revolution. At the time of the American Revolution, the term cavalry was applied to that branch of the military service whose members served and fought on horseback. The word horse was used about as often and meant essentially the same thing. By the 18th century, specialization had developed sufficiently in cavalry to bring forth 3 distinctive types of mounted commands, varying in mission, armament, and weight of horses. The heavy cavalry, used primarily for shock effect in battle. The light cavalry, designed for reconnaissance, screening missions, and messenger service. And the dragoons, trained to fight both on foot and on horseback. In actual practice, these distinctions were far from precise, and they tended to decrease in importance in the 19th century. In North America, the traditional cavalryman has ever been the light dragoon, a soldier trained and equipped to fight mounted or dismounted, to perform screening and reconnaissance, and to act as a scout or a messenger. Never was the need for a skilled cavalry more apparent than at the Battle of White Plains on October 18, 1776. After British General William Howe is driven from Boston in March, Howe and his men set up a base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and set their sights on capturing colonist-controlled New York City. After intelligence-gathering missions have confirmed to Washington that British troops have begun taking positions throughout what is now New York State and the Hudson River Valley, the general is sure that Howe and his redcoats are planning an attack on White Plains, home to a Continental Army supply depot. Washington immediately orders reinforcements, but they wouldn't be enough to save White Plains or New York City.
General Washington selected a position near White Plains, fortified by 2 lines of entrenchments, and there awaited Howe's attack. The trenches were on slightly rising ground, the left protected by swampy ground and the right resting on the Bronx River. Beyond the right was a piece of high ground called Chatterton's Hill, which commanded the plain over which Howe would have to advance. It was occupied by Hazlitt's Delaware Regiment, with 2 guns of Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, and supported by McDougall's brigade, in all about 1,600 men.
Although Howe outnumbered Washington, he deemed it unwise to attack the main position until he had gained possession of Chatterton's Hill. He therefore sent Leslie with his own brigade and 3 regiments of Hessians, about 4,000 men in all, to dislodge Hazlitt. They forded the Bronx and advanced up the hill, their attack preceded by a sharp artillery fire from 13 guns posted on the east side of the Bronx River. Such effective resistance was made by 2 excellent regiments in McDougall's brigade and by Hamilton's 2 guns that the first attack failed. Later, it was renewed in front, while Rail, with one of his Hessian regiments, made his way around Hazlitt's right flank, and this attack succeeded. McDougall retreated, bringing off the guns and joining Washington's main position. The chief object of Howe's maneuver, to get in rear of Washington, and by occupying a line from Long Island Sound to the Hudson to surround him and cut off his communications with New England, had thus failed. He had, nevertheless, succeeded in dividing Washington's small force into 3 bodies, one in New Jersey, at or near Fort Lee, one on Manhattan Island, at or near Fort Washington, and the 3rd at North Castle. The main body at North Castle and the most important post at Fort Washington were 25 miles apart, and Howe was between them. In December of 1776, the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons are commissioned by the Continental Army. The regiment, nicknamed Sheldon's Horse after Colonel Elisha Sheldon, who initially commands the militiamen from which the dragoons are formed, consisted of 6 units, 2 companies of light cavalry, and 5 troops from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. A major in the Light Dragoons, Benjamin Talmadge, will later become Washington's chief intelligence officer and organizer of the famous Culper spy ring, providing reconnaissance of British actions in New York. The Light Dragoons soon become known as Washington's Eyes, and through their efforts on the battlefield and their espionage, they proved to Washington, as well as the Continental Congress, the usefulness of a more intensive unit of mounted officers and infantrymen. On the 14th of March, 1777, Congress approved Washington's regimental organization for the Light Dragoons. It provided 3 field officers, a staff, and 6 troops for each regiment. Each troop contained 3 officers, 6 non-commissioned officers, a trumpeter, and 34 privates. One of the sergeants specialized in logistics, and 2 privates, an armorer and a farrier, received higher pay. The farrier provided rudimentary veterinary care and shod the horses. The staff was similar to an infantry regiment's, with the addition of a riding instructor and a saddler to keep leather gear in repair. 4 supernumeraries were cadets, undergoing training, who served the colonel as messengers. The Continental Light Dragoon Regiment was comparable to the British version, but it provided more specialists on both the troop and regimental level to allow greater dispersion on reconnaissance missions. The problems involved in procuring the horses and the special cavalry weapons and equipment, in training the horses for combat, and in developing high standards of individual skill contributed to the long periods needed to organize these regiments. While the Act of Congress was a step forward in winning the war, the challenges faced by the formation of the new units proved daunting. To assist in recruiting and training the new dragoons, the United States turns to Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish soldier who had by that point led successful campaigns in Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Recommended by Benjamin Franklin, who urged Washington to accept Pulaski into the volunteer army, Pulaski traveled to America in the summer of 1777. It would be several months before Pulaski would receive his rank, but on September 11, 1777, before Congress approved his admission into the Continental Army, Pulaski and Washington successfully fought off British troops at the Battle of Brandywine. The quick tactical work and leadership of Pulaski not only prevented a calamitous Continental defeat, but saved Washington's life. With his reputation among Americans secured, Washington makes Pulaski a brigadier general only 4 days later, and in the winter of 1777 through 1778, Pulaski trains the new corps of Continental Light Dragoons at Trenton, New Jersey. Friction between Pulaski and some American officers leads to Pulaski's resignation of that post, but in 1778, Pulaski is authorized to form his own corps, and the training and discipline imparted to the Light Dragoons have affirmed many historians' assertion that Pulaski is the father of the American cavalry. The Dragoons fight bravely in dozens of skirmishes throughout the American Revolution, but perhaps the most notable was the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina on January 17, 1781. The Continental soldiers, led by Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, with support from Colonel William Washington's 1st and 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, successfully defeat the British in a battle that sees the infantry making use of the hilly terrain as cover for musket volleys, as the dragoons provided cover as the soldiers changed positions. The Battle of Cowpens ultimately becomes the linchpin in the American effort to retake South Carolina from the British. During the late 3rd century AD, the Christian martyr St. George is born to Greek parents, whose Greek name was originally Georgios, or worker of the land. Both his father, Gerontios, and his mother, Polychronia, were of noble Christian families and raised their son with those beliefs. After the death of his parents, George applied to Emperor Diocletian for a position in the Roman army. Diocletian had known George's father, who had also been a soldier, and the emperor gladly welcomed the son of Gerontius into the ranks. Soon, George was a high-ranking officer, a part of Diocletian's imperial guard. In February of AD 303, Diocletian issues an edict demanding that all Christian soldiers be arrested. George objects, declaring himself a follower of Jesus Christ, and despite Diocletian's attempts to convert George with offerings of land and gold, George continually refused. This left Diocletian no choice but to execute George for his refusal. George gives all his money to the poor and prepares himself for his torture and execution. Not long after his grueling punishment and his beheading, George's body was returned to Lydda in Palestine for his burial, and Christians began to spread word of his martyrdom. For his bravery in the face of persecution, George was named a saint in Catholic, Anglican, and Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches. He is a patron saint in numerous countries, and his willingness to fight for what he believes in made him a perfect patron saint of the United States Cavalry. In addition to his martyrdom, St. George is also immortalized in a legend in which George does battle with a ferocious dragon and rescues a damsel in distress.
When the valiant knight perceived that his enemy was about to fly from him, he sprang fiercely, like an enraged lion, upon his prey, and boldly placed his sword across the mouth of the den. This act angered the monster, and she began to bray horribly, and turning about her speckled tail, armed with poisoned darts, she threatened to sting him. But he was not dismayed, and with his mighty arm he struck her a violent blow, which glanced from her head to her shoulder. It made her dizzy for a moment, and enkindled within her a tenfold rage. And gathering herself up into a posture for leaping, she sprang high, and winding her enormous tail about her, fell with fierce power upon the shield of our knight, whose body she instantaneously enfolded in her fearful instrument of mischief. God help the man thus wrapped in error's endless train.
While the American Revolution and the War of 1812 see dragoons and cavalry becoming integral forces in the defense of the United States, it is not until 1838 that the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania becomes the Cavalry School of Practice. In a program started from scratch, Commander Edwin Sumner was charged with training and recruiting new mounted cavalrymen. A cavalry drill manual from 1891 lays out the overall goals and operations of the school.
This school has for its object the instruction of the individual recruit, on foot and afterward that of the squad. From the beginning, the instructor will insist upon a smart appearance of the recruits and will exact that their clothing be clean and neatly adjusted. The instructor explains each movement in as few words as possible, at the same time executing it himself. He requires the recruits to take by themselves the proper position and does not touch them for the purpose of correcting them, except when they are unable to correct themselves. He avoids keeping them too long at the same movement, although each should be understood before passing to another. He exacts by degrees the desired precision and uniformity.
The school is a success, and the United States government commissions 2 more cavalry schools throughout the 1880s, one at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and another at Fort Riley, Kansas. The cavalry schools operated at Forts Riley and Leavenworth under various names until October of 1946. By then, new technologies, namely tanks, automobiles, and planes, led the United States Army to suspend all training and programs that instructed mounted troops. But in 1839 in Carlisle, Captain Samuel Ringgold would train his recruits in the use of flying artillery, which married field artillery with mounted units, and would rise to fame and even legend 7 years later during the Mexican-American War.
On the 24th of April, General Arista assumed the chief command of the Army of Mexico. On the same day, General Taylor detached a party of 63 dragoons to watch the course of the river above Matamoros. This party, under the command of Captain Thornton, were watched by the Mexicans, and at a point about 30 miles from the American camp were surprised and attacked. After the loss of 16 men killed and wounded, they were compelled to surrender to the superior forces of the Mexicans, who in large number had surrounded them in a fenced plantation field. This was the first actual fight of the war, and was received by the Mexicans as an augury favorable, but fallacious in the events which followed to their success. General Arista, desirous of making a favorable impression, treated his prisoners with distinguished respect and kindness.
In the battle that led President James K. Polk to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico, the Dragoons' defeat seems an inauspicious debut for the force during what becomes known as the Mexican-American War. However, the following month sees Lieutenant Charles May, under the command of General Zachary Taylor, leading the company of 2nd Dragoons in the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, once more against General Arista and the Mexican Army. In a retreat after the American victory at the Battle of Palo Alto, Arista moves his forces to a more secure position along a riverbed near the Rio Grande. General Taylor tasks Lieutenant May and his dragoons with clearing the Mexican battery, and the mounted soldiers overtake the battery and more, capturing Mexican General Romulo Diaz de la Vega and sending Arista and the rest of the Mexican army into a retreat. The battle results in the capture of many Mexican Army artillery pieces. It solidified the fighting reputation of the 2nd Dragoons, and it gives the United States Army a decisive win that would bolster confidence and ensure American victory over Mexico 2 years later, completing the goals set by President James K. Polk of annexation and territorial expansion in the Southwest.
St. Louis, Missouri, December 17, 1860. Sir, I have today received a letter from Major Hutter, acceding gladly to my proposal to him to accompany you to Washington. We are old officers and old friends, and if any difficulty should arise, which is barely possible, I should hope we might be of some service to you. I am reading everything I can find on the events of the day, and the more I study them, the more I am convinced that secession is treason, not in the state collectively, but in the individuals of a state who contravene the laws of the United States, and who cannot be absolved from the obligation to obey those laws by any state authority. I do not believe it would be necessary for the general government to make war upon the seceding states. The collection of the revenues and the holding of the forts, which would be indispensably necessary, would be to some extent coercion, but still they would be defensive measures. And I think the people of the South will pause some time before they will go to war with the general government. Has it occurred to you, sir, that the white males of the Cotton States are only about 1/10 of the white males of the whole country? What would posterity think of us as a people if we should let this 1/10 break up our glorious government? It is evident that affairs are becoming more and more complicated every day, but the greater the difficulties, the greater the glory in overcoming them. Will you please let me know when you will leave for Washington, and in the meantime, if I can be of any service to you, I beg you to command me. With highest respect, your obedient servant, E.V. Sumner, Colonel, USA.
Edwin V. Sumner, who had spent much of his career training, recruiting, and commanding cavalrymen, was appointed senior officer to accompany President-elect Abraham Lincoln from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. in March of 1861 on his way to assume his role as Commander-in-Chief. The United States Cavalry sees a shift in its duties during the American Civil War. While the mounted soldiers still see offensive action, duties of the cavalry now include reconnaissance missions, hearkening back to the 2nd Light Dragoons of the Revolution. Defensive actions meant to delay the onslaught of enemy forces, pursuit and harassment of defeated and retreating enemy forces, and long-distance raiding to capture enemy communications, supplies, and railroads. Organizations and designations are also shifted in a move that sees 4 types of mounted forces mobilized: cavalry, which fights mainly on horseback; mounted infantry, which moves on horseback but fights on foot; dragoons, a combination of light cavalry and infantry who fight both mounted and on foot; and the irregulars, soldiers for hire employed by both the Union and the Confederacy, with no standardization of weaponry or tactics, who would become more famous in their campaigns fighting on the side of the South. While dragoons were present leading up to and during the Civil War, the 2 official corps dragoons left in operation at the outbreak of the war were redesignated, the 1st and 2nd Cavalry. Prior to the war, the 1st and 2nd Dragoons had seen combat during the War of 1812 at the Battle of Lundy's Lane and the siege at Fort Meigs. The combined regiment of light dragoons had been dissolved 3 years after that war in 1815, but they were called upon to fight again during the Mexican-American War and during the violence that erupted between pro- and anti-slavery belligerents in Kansas and Missouri in the years leading up to the Civil War, in what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1861, the Union Army soon sees the need of a mounted strike force, and the 1st and 2nd Dragoons, now the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, become an integral part of the Army of the Potomac, mostly serving as reserve and backup defense, serving, among other places, at the Battle of Gettysburg. In addition to the rigorous training, skill, and speed required of the cavalrymen, a key component to the mounted soldiers' victory on the battlefield are the weapons they use. By the Civil War, muskets and rifles were still in use, but technological advances had equipped the soldier with the revolver as well. In the 1868 book Modern Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel George Dennison, Jr., collects his own experience with cavalry munitions, as well as musings from General Stephen Lee and Colonel Harros von Bork on the tools that cavalry carry into the battlefield. We will consider here the different arms which have been in use in mounted forces and the comparative advantages and disadvantages connected with each, taking into consideration the sword, the lance, the carbine, the pistol.
Nearly all the cavalry used by the Confederate States, and in fact by both sides, was nothing more than mounted riflemen. The saber was done away with by the Confederate States cavalry pretty well, and rarely used in action by either party, and in my opinion has lost much of its merit since the revolver has been brought to such perfection. The sword is a good weapon though, but little used during the recent war.
One of these encounters, an affair of a few minutes, was with a newly organized regiment of Federal Lancers. They stood 300 yards from us in the line of battle, and presented with their glittering lances, from the point of each of which fluttered a red and white pennon, and their fresh, well-fitting blue uniforms turned up with yellow, a fine martial appearance. One of our regiments was immediately ordered to attack them, but before our Virginian horsemen got within 50 yards of their line, this magnificent regiment, which had doubtless excited the liveliest admiration in the northern cities on its way to the seat of war, turned tail and fled in disorder, strewing the whole line of their retreat with their picturesque but inconvenient arms. I do not believe that out of the whole body of 700 men, more than 20 retained their lances, and their sudden and total discomfiture furnished a striking proof of the fact that this weapon, formidable enough in the hand of one accustomed to wield it, is a downright absurdity and encumbrance to the inexperienced.
Lomax had 3 brigades of Virginia cavalry armed principally with Enfield rifles, and these useless things for mounted men had nearly ruined the whole command. I'd rather command a regiment armed with good oaken clubs.
If the men are critical of the weaponry thus far, they save their praise solely for the pistol, perhaps the most practical firearm for use on horseback, particularly while in motion. As Colonel Gilmore continues,
I saw the lieutenant run down under the riverbank, and several throw up their hands in token of surrender. But just as I thought all had given up, a sergeant mounted his horse and dashed at me, calling out to the men to follow him. "There are only 5 men," said he. "Don't surrender to 5 men." Kemp had his revolver out and killed the brave fellow before he came within reach of my saber, but the rest had taken courage and began to mount and come at us, with balls whistling around their heads. Had I drawn my pistols instead of saber, several would have fallen, for we were at close quarters.
as the cavalry continues its evolution, we will see technology throughout the ages advancing beyond the saber, the Enfield, and even the horse. Each generation of cavalry continues a proud tradition while employing and embracing technological change. From the ancient Greeks to the dawn of the American Civil War, we see the dragoon and the cavalrymen only begin to assert their place in history, and the United States Cavalry become a force to be reckoned with. As the conflicts, technologies, and attitudes change throughout the years, we shall come to see the cavalry become a crucial element of the United States Army. Perhaps the most iconic image of the United States cavalrymen is one of the mounted soldiers of the Old West, as noted law and military men like George Armstrong Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and future President Theodore Roosevelt lead cavalrymen on the battlefields of the western frontier and Mexico. Another future notable figure and cavalryman who serves during the Pancho Villa expedition is George S. Patton. He is soon to be known as the fightingest general of World War II, and he had this to say about his time with the cavalry and the army.
Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads that gains the victory.
Soon, we will meet the legendary figures that have captured the American imagination and further solidify the reputation of the United States Cavalry.
So a radical concept in military organization has proven itself. It is an important step in a world where the speed with which a fighting force can react in the field can be the deciding factor in victory. The new Air Mobile Division is not a replacement for its heavier infantry counterpart, but it is, like the old cavalry, a fast, hard-hitting doer of special jobs. A new, agile, important addition to the versatile combat capability of the United States Army. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. The new first team.
The power to command men and give vehement impulse to their joint action is something which cannot be defined by words, but it is plain and manifest in battles, and whoever commands an army in chief must choose his subordinates by reason of qualities which can alone be tested in actual conflict.
General William Tecumseh Sherman is renowned for his strategy and leadership, and recognizes that only the best must be chosen to lead American soldiers on the battlefield. In the final years of the American Civil War, the United States Cavalry plays an ever-increasingly important role in the Union victory over the Confederate Army. With their expanding numbers, it is important that the cavalry be led by only the finest soldiers of their day. As General of the Army, Ulysses S. Grant has this to say about one of the cavalry's most storied leaders, Philip Sheridan.
I believe General Sheridan has no superior as a general, either living or dead, and perhaps not an equal.
General Sheridan, along with General George Armstrong Custer and legions of other cavalrymen, will soon turn their focus from the war between the states to the war to tame the Wild West.
Near midnight, I sent the dispatch giving the names of the generals captured. In the same dispatch, I wrote, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." When Mr. Lincoln at City Point received this word from General Grant, who was transmitting every item of news to the President, he telegraphed Grant the laconic message, "Let the thing be pressed."
By the time Robert E. Lee is ready to surrender his Confederate Army in 1865, Major General Philip Sheridan, the rest of the Army, and cavalry leaders, and indeed much of the country, welcomes an end to the fighting. The United States Cavalry had come into its own on the battlefields of the American Civil War. Until 1863, it appeared that the Confederate Army held the edge when it came to cavalry battles and tactics. On June 9th, Confederate Major General Jeb Stuart, planning to oversee a movement of 9,500 troops, including 5 cavalry units, through the Shenandoah Valley and northward to Pennsylvania, is surprised at 4:30 a.m. by attacks from the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, with attacks from Brigadier General John Buford from the northeast, and later from the southeast, from Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg. All told, 11,000 Union cavalrymen charged the unsuspecting, though not fully unprepared, Confederate Cavalry Colonel J.H. Kidd. In Kidd's book, Personal Recollections of a Cavalryman, he describes the battle.
All the fighting in this battle was done on horseback, and no more daring work was done by either side on any of the battlefields of the war than was seen at Brandy Station. It must have been a pretty picture. Federal regiments halting and facing toward the points of the compass whence these attacks came, then falling back to new positions, stubbornly contesting every inch of ground. The fluttering of guidons and battle flags, the flash of sabers and the puffs of pistol shots. Altogether, a most brilliant spectacle.
While the results of the battle would be called inconclusive, Brandy Station not only marks the beginning of the Gettysburg Campaign, but for the first time, it demonstrates that the Union and Confederate cavalry are evenly matched. The following month sees General Robert E. Lee's defeat and retreat from Gettysburg, becoming an important turning point in the American Civil War. The battle would mark the final Confederate offensive move, with the subsequent retreat and remaining battles of the war seeing only defensive maneuvers from the Southern armies. 2 years later, April 1865, sees Robert E. Lee's army outnumbered and weakened by numerous losses through desertion, defeat, and disease. When General Ulysses S. Grant shatters the defensive lines of the Confederates in the Third Battle of Petersburg, Lee orders an evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond and tries to flee south to join with the Confederate forces in North Carolina. However, relentless harassment from Grant's pursuing Union soldiers drive Lee to hole up in Appomattox. And on April 8th, Major General George Armstrong Custer's cavalry division successfully seizes and destroys a train loaded with Confederate supplies and guns. The battle at Appomattox Station not only severs Lee's supply line, but stops the Confederate Army in their tracks and forces Confederate artillery divisions into battle against Union cavalrymen without infantry support. That same day, Grant sends a message to Lee detailing terms of surrender. It is assumed by the Union Army that this meant an end to the war. Lee, on the other hand, is determined to make a final effort to escape the Union forces. On April 9th, assured that the fighting was drawing to a close, General Sheridan's cavalry was surprised to find Confederate corps advancing upon them. Sheridan himself describes the events of that day.
I decided to attack at once, and formations were ordered at a trot for a charge by Custer's and Devon's divisions down the slope leading to the camps. Devon's preparations were but partially completed when an aide-de-camp galloped up with the word from Custer, "Lee has surrendered. Do not charge. The white flag is up." The enemy, perceiving that Custer was forming for attack, had sent the flag out to his front and stopped the charge just in time. I had once sent word of the truce to General Ord, and hearing nothing more from Custer himself, I supposed that he had gone down to the courthouse to join a mounted group of Confederates that I could see near there. So I, too, went toward them, galloping down a narrow ridge, staff and orderlies following. But we had not got halfway to the courthouse when, from a skirt of timber to our right, not more than 300 yards distant, a musketry fire was opened on us. This halted us, when, waving my hat, I called out to the firing party that we were under a truce and they were violating it. This did not stop them, however, so we hastily took shelter in a ravine so situated as to throw the ridge between us and the danger. We traveled in safety, and then by a gentle ascent approached the courthouse. I was in advance, followed by a sergeant carrying my battle flag. When I got within about 150 yards of the enemy's line, which was immediately in front of the courthouse, some of the Confederates leveled their pieces at us, and I again halted. Their officers kept their men from firing, however, but meanwhile a single-handed contest had begun behind me, for on looking back I heard a Confederate soldier demanding my battle flag from the color-bearer, thinking, no doubt, that we were coming in as prisoners. The sergeant had drawn his saber and was about to cut the man down, but at a word from me he desisted and carried the flag back to my staff, his assailant quickly realizing that the boot was on the other leg. These incidents determined me to remain where I was till the return of a staff officer whom I had sent over to demand an explanation from the group of Confederates for which I had been heading. He came back in a few minutes with apologies for what had occurred and informed me that General Gordon and General Wilcox were the superior officers in the group. As they wished me to join them, I rode up with my staff, but we had hardly met when in front of Merritt firing began. When quiet was restored, Gordon remarked, "General Lee asks for a suspension of hostilities pending the negotiations which he is having with General Grant." I rejoined, "I have been constantly informed of the progress of the negotiations, and think it singular that while such discussions are going on, General Lee should have continued his march and attempted to break through my lines this morning. I will entertain no terms except that General Lee shall surrender to General Grant on his arrival here. If these terms are not accepted, we will renew hostilities." Gordon replied, General Lee's army is exhausted. There is no doubt of his surrender to General Grant.
When Grant's own Union forces arrive to aid Sheridan's cavalry, Lee finds himself surrounded on 3 sides and finally agrees to sit down with Grant and negotiate a surrender. Lee might have escaped to Lynchburg if it weren't for the general that Grant spoke so highly of, General Philip Henry Sheridan. Born to Irish immigrants and raised in Somerset, Ohio, Philip Henry Sheridan works, as a boy, in several general stores. Sheridan will always be short in stature, reaching a height of 5'5" when fully grown. Later, President Abraham Lincoln will famously describe him as
a brown, chunky little chap with a long body, short legs, not enough neck to hang him, and such long arms that if his ankles itch, he can scratch them without stooping.
His military career begins when, in 1848, one of Sheridan's regular customers, United States Congressman Thomas Ritchie, recommends Sheridan's appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Ritchie's initial choice for the appointment failed an entrance exam and was dismissed for having a poor attitude. Sheridan fares only slightly better at the academy, and in his 3rd year, he is suspended for fist-fighting and threatening to stab another cadet with a bayonet in response to what Sheridan perceived as an insult. In 1853, Sheridan graduates 34th in his class of 52. Commissioned as a brevet 2nd lieutenant after his graduation, Sheridan receives assignments to the 1st and 4th U.S. Infantry at Fort Duncan, Texas, and Redding, California. While serving with the 4th Infantry, Sheridan becomes involved with the Yakima and Rogue River Wars, not only fighting with Indians in the Pacific Northwest, but acquiring useful skill in diplomatic relations with the natives. Just before the outset of the Civil War in 1861, Sheridan is promoted to 1st lieutenant. By May, he is made captain. A year later, Sheridan finds himself appointed colonel of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, in spite of having no previous experience either leading or participating in mounted battle. Sheridan's leadership experience with the 4th Infantry ensures that his first time commanding cavalry forces in battle is a successful one. In the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh, Colonel Sheridan holds back the forces of Confederate cavalry, led by Brigadier General James R. Chalmers, as Confederate General Braxton Bragg tries to regain control of the rail junction 20 miles north of Booneville, Mississippi. Sheridan's efforts cost Chalmers 65 Confederate troops and causes Bragg to abandon his attempt at taking the rail junction. It also earned Sheridan his promotion to Brigadier General. The attention paid to Sheridan by his superiors soon extends to General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant, who taps Sheridan to command the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac in April of 1864. By the following year, Sheridan is leading his cavalry in what will prove to be the final actions of the Civil War, the Appomattox Campaign. Stationed at Dinwiddie Courthouse, Sheridan writes to Major General Gouverneur K. Warren of the Union Army's 5th Corps with information on enemy movement and a plan of attack.
I am holding in front of Dinwiddie Courthouse, on the road leading to Five Forks, for 3/4 of a mile with General Custer's division. The enemy are in his immediate front, lying so as to cover the road just this side of A. Adams' house, which leads across Chamberlain's Bed, or Run. I understand you have a division at J. Boisseau's. If so, you are in rear of the enemy's line and almost on his flank. I will hold on here. Possibly they may attack Custer at daylight. If so, attack instantly and in full force. Attack at daylight anyhow, and I will make an effort to get the road this side of Adams' house. And if I do, you can capture the whole of them. Any force moving down the road I am holding or on the White Oak Road will be in the enemy's rear, and in all probability get any force that may escape you by a flank movement. Do not fear my leaving here. If the enemy remains, I shall fight at daylight. P.H. Sheridan, Major General.
When Warren fails to muster his troops until 4 p.m. that afternoon, Sheridan furiously and controversially removes Warren from his command, effectively ending his military career. It is later ruled that while Grant did defer to Sheridan's judgment on such matters, that Sheridan had no authority to remove Warren. In spite of this confusion, the Battle of Five Forks, the skirmish in question, becomes known as the Confederates' Waterloo, and 2 days later, Robert E. Lee would begin his retreat west, eventually reaching his final position of the war, Appomattox Courthouse. In the years following the Civil War, Sheridan continues to serve with the cavalry, not only as a part of the Indian Wars of the West, but as a crusader for the protection of some of America's most pristine land, Yellowstone National Park. While the preservation of the frontier was a priority for Sheridan, so too was the protection of those Americans who wanted to expand the country to the west. It was during the Indian Wars where Sheridan would once again ride alongside a cavalry general, also present during the Appomattox campaign, and a man who came to Sheridan's rescue at the Battle of Five Forks. Perhaps the most storied cavalryman of them all, General George Armstrong Custer.
Custer, with flashing eye and flowing hair, charging at the head of his men, was a grand and picturesque figure, the more so by reason of his fantastic uniform, which made him a conspicuous mark for the enemy's bullets. But a coward in Custer's uniform would have become the laughingstock of the Army.
While Custer is perhaps best remembered for his last stand, the man's legend begins at West Point in 1858, where he at once demonstrates a contempt for rules and authority. A young schoolteacher, born and educated in Ohio, roommates notice that Custer is indifferent to whether or not he is prepared for his classes or his drill. Nearly facing expulsion in all of the 3 years Custer spent at the academy, he earns one of the worst conduct records in the academy's history, racking up 726 demerits, the record total. In spite of his conduct, and of graduating dead last in his class, the outbreak of the Civil War sees Custer graduate a year early. And while normal circumstances would have seen Custer assigned to a backwater outpost, Custer instead serves as a second lieutenant in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in the First Battle of Bull Run. Custer quickly proves himself to be an able leader and tactician. Serving under General Sheridan, Custer leads successful campaigns against the Confederates in such battles as 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. During the Appomattox campaign, Custer is given a brevet, or temporary wartime promotion, to Major General, and his actions in battle more than justify the honor. A fellow Major General under Sheridan, Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbert, recalls the fearless and tireless efforts of Custer as he led his cavalry unit to a decisive victory.
The next day, I had received orders from Major General Sheridan to start out at daylight and whip the rebel cavalry or get whipped myself. Brigadier General Custer captured 6 pieces of artillery, all they had on the back road, all of their headquarters wagons, ordnance, ambulance, and wagon trains. There could hardly have been a more complete victory and rout.
As Robert E. Lee retreats in April of 1865, Custer's division repeatedly harasses and blocks the path of the Confederate soldiers, reportedly becoming the first Union squad to receive a flag of truce from the Confederate forces. In the year following the war, Custer finds himself a bit adrift. After marching Union occupation forces of the 2nd Division Cavalry from Alexandria, Louisiana to Hampstead, Texas, Custer's unit is mustered out and replaced with the 6th Cavalry Regiment, and his wartime rank is stripped, returning to his original rank of captain. He takes a leave of absence, during which Custer considers careers in mining, railroads, and politics. However, by 1867, Custer is back in the saddle again. Sheridan has been tasked by Commanding General Ulysses S. Grant to restore order to the Great Plains. Violence in Texas, the Dakotas, and Colorado between settlers and Indian peoples has escalated in the final years of the Civil War. Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer is first stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, before taking part in campaigns against the Cheyenne and establishing Camp Supply, a fort embedded in Indian territory, as support for Sheridan's campaign against the Southern Plain Indians in the winter of 1868. It is from this lonely outpost, in what is now part of the state of Oklahoma, that Custer would lead his most famous raids with the 7th Cavalry and engage in some of the bloodiest conflicts of the Indian Wars. Custer defends the actions of the cavalry in their engagement with the Indians in his biography, My Life on the Plains, published in 1874.
There are two classes of people who are always eager to get up an Indian war: the Army and our frontiersmen. I quote from an editorial on the Indian question, which not long since appeared in the columns of one of the leading New York daily newspapers. That this statement was honestly made, I do not doubt, but that instead of it being true, it could not have been further from the truth. I will attempt to show. I assert, and all candid persons familiar with the subject will sustain the assertion, that of all classes of our population, the Army and the people living on the frontier entertain the greatest dread of an Indian war, and are willing to make great sacrifices to avoid its horrors.
After the Civil War, it is the policy of the United States to assign all Indians to reservations, with the Army and the Cavalry designated to keep them there. However, an influx of settlers into the American West, thanks to the boom of railroad construction and gold rushes in certain towns, creates frictions and tensions. While fierce cavalrymen like General Philip Sheridan and General George Custer are dispatched into the continuing battle with Indians, the cavalrymen come armed with weapons that have been honed and perfected during the Civil War.
Pick up your sabers and fight like gentlemen.
About the only good use of a saber during wartime is for roasting meat over a campfire.
By the end of the American Civil War, trial, error, and innovation by weapons manufacturers, at the behest of the United States government, sees the cavalry outfitted with newer, more reliable weaponry. The Army still insists upon issuing sabers to its cavalrymen. However, some generals, including Custer, order their men to leave the impractical arms behind. As no bayonets were issued, some cavalrymen carry personal hunting knives, like Bowie knives, for use in hand-to-hand combat. For mounted shock weapons, the revolver is the issued firearm, specifically the Model 1873 single-action Colt 45. The 6-shot barrel is rotated by hand by pulling back the hammer after each shot. Later revolvers would rotate the chamber automatically, but the Model 1873 earns the nickname the Thumb Buster. Still, the gun's solid design makes the piece a rugged and reliable tool for mounted battle. Initially, during the Indian Wars, Custer's 7th Cavalry had been experimenting with using the Spencer carbine. The lever-action rifle is not embraced by the U.S. Army, as officials worry that the ability to rapidly fire, while perhaps providing a momentary advantage on the battlefield, would cause soldiers to waste and deplete their ammunition supply. The breech-loading Model 1873 Springfield trapdoor carbine becomes the rifle of the cavalry throughout the Indian Wars, though Custer's 7th Cavalry would be the last division to receive them in 1876. The trapdoor is the first Army standard issue breech-loading rifle. While many reports exist of the trapdoor rifle jamming in the heat of battle, the gun is still far more reliable and efficient than anything soldiers have carried so far, especially compared to barrel-loading muskets used during the Civil War. Thus armed, the cavalry rides into battle with Indians. While the United States employs the most advanced weaponry at the time, the sheer number of Indians, their undying courage and spirit, and the wide cross-section of both traditional and modern weapons and firearms that they trade for becomes a serious roadblock on the way to peaceful resolution on the plains. The cavalry also makes use of a previously untapped resource in the West: African American cavalrymen and soldiers, having earned their freedom in the Civil War, now wished to fight for their country as buffalo soldiers.
It is not generally known that Atlanta has a Negro cadet at the United States National Military Academy at West Point. He is about 20 years old, a stoutish fellow weighing perhaps 150 pounds, and a smart, bright, intelligent boy. His father is a shoemaker and gave him the euphonious name of Henry Ossian Flipper. It is an astonishing fact that, socially, the boys from the northern and western states will have nothing to do with their colored brother. Not even the Massachusetts boys will associate with him. But the sensible Flipper accepted the situation and proudly refused to intrude himself on the white boys. The feeling of ostracism is so strong that a white boy who dared to recognize a colored cadet would be himself ostracized by the other white cubs, even of radical extraction.
In 1877, Henry Ossian Flipper becomes the very first African American to graduate from the United States National Military Academy. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in July of that year, Flipper reports to Fort Sill in Oklahoma for assignment to the 10th Cavalry. Instead of sending him on to Fort Concho, headquarters of the 10th Cavalry, more commonly known as the Buffalo Soldiers, the brass at Fort Sill put Flipper to work on menial tasks, including digging a ditch to drain a nearby swamp. When finally the orders come to send Flipper to Fort Concho for his assignment, Henry Ossian Flipper is then made a part of A Troop and named the first non-white officer to lead the Buffalo Soldiers. Officially founded at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in 1866, the Buffalo Soldiers is a moniker given to the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, as well as the 24th and 25th Infantry, all units of African American soldiers, traditionally led by white officers. Many of the units are raised and operated in the final years of the American Civil War and continued to develop and mature during the Indian Wars. In skirmishes throughout the southwestern United States, the soldiers earn their nickname from their Indian opponents that they face on the prairies and the plains. Soon, the Cheyenne Indians are warning their fellow tribes of a new warrior fighting for the Americans, who had fought like a cornered buffalo, who, like a buffalo, had suffered wound after wound, yet had not died. While African Americans have made great progress towards equality since the end of the Civil War, there is still a long road before them. Henry Ossian Flipper, as well as countless other units and individuals, faced prejudice and even violence, sometimes even from those who had been assigned to lead them. In 1881, Flipper faced court-martial for a discrepancy that was found in the commissary funds at Fort Davis. Flipper was quartermaster and commissary officer until Colonel Shafter, known to harass officers and soldiers he didn't like, stripped his quartermaster title and commanded that the commissary funds be kept in Flipper's private quarters rather than their usual place in the quartermaster's safe. While Flipper suspected foul play, and Captain Merritt Barber of the 16th U.S. Infantry defended Flipper valiantly in court, in December, the court-martial rules that Henry is not guilty of embezzlement, but still dismisses him for conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman. In spite of this prejudice, personal and physical attacks by their own fellow officers, the Buffalo Soldiers continued to prove themselves as a valuable asset throughout the late 19th and early into the 20th century. In addition to fighting in the Indian Wars, units of Buffalo Soldiers continued to serve with the United States Cavalry in the Spanish-American War and maintained border safety between the United States and Mexico during World War I, and participate in Woodrow Wilson's Punitive expedition in 1917 in an attempt to track down the notorious outlaw Pancho Villa. In 1899, Buffalo Soldiers also become some of the very first National Park Rangers, as members of the 9th Cavalry and 24th Infantry are assigned to maintain, protect, and preserve such parks, such as Yosemite, Kings Canyon, and Sequoia National. Before the United States military began to fully integrate, members of the so-called Buffalo Soldiers served proudly in World War II, with the 9th and 10th Cavalry Divisions being dissolved to form more service-oriented black platoons, including artillery and tank destroyer units. During the Korean War, the 24th Infantry becomes the last segregated troop to serve for the United States military. Displaced from their homeland and forced to move from Kansas to Colorado, members of the Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and other tribes begin to attack white settlements in Kansas, Colorado, and Texas in the summer of 1868. The Southern Cheyenne, led by Chief Black Kettle, are camped on the banks of the Washita River in November of 1868. General Philip Sheridan, in response to the continued Indian raids on American settlers throughout the summer and fall, has devised a plan to attack the Cheyenne encampments, destroying supplies and livestock. General Custer is charged with leading the raid and explains his strategy in his autobiography.
Indians contemplating a battle, either offensive or defensive, are always anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger. For this reason, I decided to locate our camp as close as convenient to Chief Black Kettle's village, knowing that the close proximity of their women and children and their necessary exposure in case of conflict would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace when the question of peace or war came to be discussed.
By November 26th, attempts to negotiate peace between both the Indians and the settlers, and among the Indian tribes themselves, have resulted in a stalemate. Custer's forces, divided into 4 units, stalk an Indian war party back to Black Kettle's village and attack at daybreak the following day. Chief Black Kettle and his wife are among those Indians killed, and while Custer quickly takes the village, he had been unaware of the proximity of Black Kettle's village to another Indian camp, until he notices large groups of Indians gathering on adjacent hilltops. In fear of attack, General Custer orders some men to take defensive positions while leading a charge to destroy and seize Indian horses and munitions. The gathering Indians retreat when confronted. The battle at Washita River affirms General Custer's reputation as a cavalryman, but at the same time, a shadow was cast over incidents involving one of Custer's majors, Joel Elliott, who led a small detachment of cavalry into a doomed battle with a mixed party of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa Indians. Major Elliott had apparently broken with Custer's orders in leading the charge, which led to the death of 20 soldiers. Custer brashly dismissed Elliott, leaving the scene of battle without confirming Elliott's fate. Feelings of resentment towards Custer spread through the 7th Cavalry, including H Company Captain Frederick Benteen, a personal friend of Elliott. 8 years later, Benteen failed to reach the Battle of Little Bighorn in time to save Custer and his men, and many wonder if this failing was merely circumstantial or if Benteen's enmity played a role.
If the lives and property of the citizens of Montana can best be protected by striking Mountain Chief's band, I want them struck. Tell Baker to strike them hard.
In the Montana Territory in 1869, the Blackfeet, Blood, and Piegan Indians, collectively known as the Blackfoot Confederacy, have engaged in hostilities with the white settlers for years. Bringing matters to a head, the murder of Malcolm Clark, a white trader who had married and fathered children with Blackfeet Indian women, was killed by a Piegan warrior, Owl Child. Owl Child sought revenge on Clark after Clark had beaten him in front of a group of Blackfeet Indians as punishment for stealing Clark's horses. Accounts from Indians also raised the possibility that Clark had raped Owl Child's wife, and further rumors tell the story that she had given birth to a stillborn, mixed-race baby. The Clark killing is cause for outcry in the area among the white settlers. They demand that the government suppress the outlaw Indians and protect them from further attacks. U.S. Army representatives issue a command to the Blackfoot Confederacy. Owl Child is to be killed and his body delivered to United States authorities within 2 weeks. 2 weeks come and go, and soon General Sheridan dispatches Major Eugene Baker to lead a punitive expedition in January of 1870. Tragically, Baker, a known alcoholic, attacks the camp of Heavy Runner, a peaceful leader who had been previously protected by the U.S. Army. When Heavy Runner is alerted to the cavalry's presence, he rushes to show Baker documentation from the Indian Bureau, and he is shot. After the first shot, the rest of Baker's men open fire, slaughtering elderly men, women, and children, as most of the men were out hunting. Mountain Chief, leading the band that was actually reported to be harboring Owl Child, gets word of the massacre and escapes the Marias River area. The massacre at Marias River not only weakens the Blackfeet's hostilities, disease and fighting had thinned out their ranks, but leads to now President Ulysses S. Grant to adopt a peace policy in Indian relations, rather than leaving Indian affairs to the United States Army. Sadly, the policy does not end the fighting between Indians and the Americans, as one of the cavalry's most famous fighters is slain in one of the West's most famous battles.
I went over the battlefield carefully, with a view to determine how the battle was fought. I arrived at the conclusion I hold now, that it was a rout, a panic, until the last man was killed.
First-hand accounts from Americans at the Battle of Little Bighorn do not exist. None of the 5 companies under Custer's command survived the attack, and as Captain Benteen's report of the scene after the battle illustrates, there is probably much chaos. Bad intelligence leads the 7th Cavalry into the Montana Territory to quell what had been dubbed the Sioux Wars. A coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians, led by Chiefs Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and others, prepares for war after years of increasing tensions with Americans encroaching on their sacred land, and the vision of Sitting Bull, who foretells of soldiers falling into my camp like grasshoppers from the sky. While reports from the Army estimated no more than 800 Indian combatants, Custer is actually faced with thousands upon thousands. As Major Marcus Reno and Captain Benteen contend with assaults from Crazy Horse and other warriors, Custer's forces are stopped east of the Little Bighorn River. Debate continues today about the true events of the battle, but the result is still clear. General Custer and his cavalrymen are completely obliterated. One of the only eyewitness accounts of the massacre comes from Lakota Chief Red Horse, who fought in the battle and recalled the events 5 years later.
The soldiers charged the Sioux camp about noon. The soldiers were divided, one party charging right into the camp. After driving these soldiers across the river, the Sioux charged the different soldiers of Custer's below and drive them in confusion. These soldiers became foolish, many throwing away their guns and raising their hands, saying, "Sioux, pity us, take us prisoner." None were left alive for even a few minutes. These different soldiers discharged their guns but little. I took a gun and 2 belts off of 2 dead soldiers. Out of one belt, 2 cartridges were gone. Out of the other, 5. The Sioux took the guns and cartridges off the dead soldiers and went to the hill on which the soldiers were, surrounded and fought them with the guns and cartridges of the dead soldiers. Had the soldiers not divided, I think they would have killed many Sioux. The different soldiers that the Sioux killed made 5 brave stands. Once the Sioux charged right in the midst of the different soldiers and scattered them all, fighting amongst the soldiers hand to hand. The Sioux went but a short distance before they separated and surrounded the soldiers. I could see the officers riding in front of the soldiers and hear them shooting. Now the Sioux had many killed. The soldiers killed 136 and wounded 160 Sioux.
Other Lakota eyewitnesses seem to agree that the battle took less than half an hour. The aftermath of the battle wasn't even discovered until 2 days later. George Armstrong Custer was found and buried on the battlefield. Later, he will be exhumed and returned to the place he began his military career. Custer's final resting place is the West Point Cemetery, where he is buried on October 10th, 1877. In many ways, Custer's last stand serves as the close of a chapter in the history of the United States Cavalry. But from the end of the 19th into the beginning of the 20th century, the proud legacy of the cavalry continues to proliferate. As the cavalry rebuilds in the years following the Battle of Little Bighorn, technological advances in weapons, transportation, and communication are made, sometimes by leaps and bounds. These advances, while adding much to the advantage of the American cavalrymen, are still but only new tools to be utilized by the most capable leaders. The United States Cavalry's tradition of legendary leaders has only begun, with courageous figures emerging to fight for their country both on America's home soil and abroad as the world goes to war. Rising to meet such challenges are such figures as Theodore Roosevelt, John J. Pershing, and George S. Patton, and Medal of Honor recipients like Sergeant Major Edward L. Baker and Corporal Dennis Bell. These men, and many others, through their bravery, dedication, and sacrifice, will continue to solidify the reputation of the United States Cavalry. As the United States expands and settles in the American West toward the close of the 19th century, the United States Cavalry begins, too, to expand and evolve. The abolition of slavery in the United States saw other countries following suit. In 1886, the island nation of Cuba abolishes slavery, and former enslaved men and women joined the workforce as farmers and other members of the working class. Still under Spanish rule, Cuba soon sees an influx of investment capital from the United States, thanks to their tobacco, sugar, and mining operations, to the tune of nearly $50 million. By 1895, labor unions have risen to prominence in the nation, and Cuban revolutionaries like José Martí begin to advocate for independence from Spain. While Martí gains much sympathy and support in the United States through political organizations and clubs across the country, he also recognizes the fact that if Cuba does not achieve independence, the United States may annex the land for its own. This belief is further anchored by the annexation plans for the island of Hawaii and the sentiments of Secretary of State James G. Blaine, who said,
"That rich island, the key to the Gulf of Mexico, is, though in the hands of Spain, a part of the American commercial system. If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any other European domination."
Though many in the United States push for American intervention in the Cubans' fight for independence, the country remains neutral, though the capture of ships smuggling weapons to the severely outgunned Cuban revolutionaries by U.S. Navy and Coast Guard inadvertently aids the Spanish in the fight. In January of 1898, a riot in Havana led the U.S. Consul General to wire Washington for aid, fearing for American lives in Cuba. The following month sees the battleship USS Maine, sent in response to the cable, destroyed by explosion, and yellow journalism from Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal only adds fuel to the fire of American anti-Spanish sentiment when it is initially reported that the Maine was sunk by a Spanish mine. On April 20th, 1898, the United States officially declared war on Spain.
Wood and I were speedily commissioned as Colonel and Lieutenant Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. This was the official title of the regiment, but for some reason or other, the public promptly christened us the Rough Riders. At first, we fought against the use of the term, but to no purpose. And when finally the generals of division and brigade began to write informal communications about our regiment as the Rough Riders, we adopted the term ourselves.
One of the voices calling for American involvement in the Cuban fight for independence was former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt is named second in command to Colonel Leonard Wood, chosen to lead the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, one of 3 units established by the United States Cavalry to assist in the war effort. As ordered by President William McKinley, cavalry volunteers are organized and trained in the southwestern states of Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, reasoning that the soldiers from these areas will be well equipped to handle the similar climate in Cuba. The end of the American Civil War had seen a weakened military force in the United States, but McKinley's call to action inspires thousands to apply for a position. As Roosevelt says, the difficulty in organizing was not selecting, but rejecting men.
Harvard being my own college, I had such a swarm of applications from it that I could not take 1 in 10. What particularly pleased me, not only in the Harvard, but the Yale and Princeton men, and indeed in these recruits from the older states generally, was that they did not ask for commissions. With hardly an exception, they entered upon their duties as troopers, in the spirit which they held to the end, merely endeavoring to show that no work could be too hard, too disagreeable, or too dangerous for them to perform, and neither asking nor receiving any reward in the way of promotion or consideration.
Strong shooters and horsemen all, the volunteers are from a wide range of backgrounds. Former miners and prospectors, cowboys, Native Americans, hunters, gamblers, and retired police and military personnel. They were looking for a path to further adventure. Initially, they are led by Colonel Leonard Wood, and known colloquially and in the press as Wood's Weary Walkers. Despite the fact that they are a cavalry unit, much of their fighting and traveling was done on foot, engaging in hand-to-hand combat due to inadequate transportation and logistics while they were entering Cuba. Thanks to Roosevelt, who was at first Wood's lieutenant colonel and soon the leader of the 1st Cavalry, the men are well equipped and armored. Through his connections as the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt sees to it that the members of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry are outfitted with the finest gear and weaponry. The Rough Riders, as the press soon dubbed them, are given 1892 through 98 Springfield bolt-action rifles, Colt 45 revolvers, Bowie knives, and the best horse accoutrements and camping equipment. The unit is also equipped with 2 M1 985 Colt Browning machine guns, a 7mm Mauser caliber gas-operated tripod-mounted weapon. While the Rough Riders are issued the same quality and quantity of weaponry and supplies as the regular U.S. Army, their uniforms, by design, set the men apart. Roosevelt describes their choice of attire.
The Rough Rider uniform was a slouch hat, blue flannel shirt, brown trousers, leggings, and boots, with handkerchiefs knotted loosely around their necks. They looked exactly as a body of a cowboy cavalry should look.
By June of 1898, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry sees their first engagement with the Spanish in Cuba at the Battle of Las Guasimas. Weakened from their march and beset by disease and infection, still the cavalry marched. When Edward Marshall, a reporter who had been embedded with the Rough Riders and who had been inspired by the men around him to join the fight, was killed, many mistook him at long range for Colonel Wood. Hearing of Wood's supposed death, Roosevelt takes charge of the men and leads the cavalry to their first victory of the Spanish-American War. Later, it is revealed that Wood had survived, but General Joseph Wheeler, a veteran of the Civil War, had been stricken with illness, having been replaced by the 2nd Brigade's commander, Brigadier General Samuel S. Sumner, to take over his command. Wood assumed Sumner's former command of the 2nd Brigade as Brigadier General, and Roosevelt is promoted to Colonel and tasked with leading the 1st Unit. Roosevelt first leads the Rough Riders into the Battle of San Juan Hill, which will become a decisive victory for the Americans, but not by Roosevelt's hand alone. Initially, simply charged with holding a position at San Juan Hill, near a Spanish entrenchment, the Rough Riders marched 8 miles to the area with little to no plan of attack. The enemy entrenchments are on a hill dubbed Kettle Hill, and this position and San Juan Hill are separated by a pond and a small valley called San Juan Heights by the Americans. While the 1st and 10th Infantry charge the trenches and blockhouse at San Juan Hill, they are assisted by the 10th Cavalry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a cavalry division made up of African American cavalrymen. It is the 10th Cavalry that would later lead Roosevelt and his Rough Riders into battle at Kettle Hill. Roosevelt's troops provided support to the Buffalo Soldiers, and when it was thought that the Spanish, with a superior position and larger numbers, might claim victory in the battle, Lieutenant John H. Parker commands a trio of Gatling guns, firing over 18,000 .30 caliber Army rounds at the enemy. Sadly, the Buffalo Soldiers' contribution to the victory at San Juan Hill is ignored by the American press, but none of the cavalry or infantrymen would have claimed victory if it weren't for Parker's guns, as Roosevelt himself acknowledges.
I think Parker deserved rather more credit than any other one man in the entire campaign. He had the rare good judgment and foresight to see the possibilities of the machine guns. He then, by his own exertions, got it to the front and proved that it could do invaluable work on the field of battle, as much in attack as in defense.
The Gatling gun remains a crucial element in the support of not only the Rough Riders, but the whole of the United States Armed Forces deployed in Cuba. As the infantry and cavalry work to ensnare the city of Santiago, driving the Spanish Navy from the port and into a battle with the U.S. Navy, Roosevelt again credits the Gatlings as the linchpin of the entire U.S. military operation, as he describes the Rough Riders' harrowing experience during the siege of Santiago, July 3rd through 17th, 1898.
When the shrapnel burst among us on the hillside, we made up our minds that we had better settle down to solid siege work. All of the men who were not in the trenches I took off to the right, back to the Gatling guns, where there was a valley, and dispersed them by troops in sheltered parts. It took us an hour or two's experimenting to find out exactly what spots were free from danger, because some of the Spanish sharpshooters were in trees in our front, where we could not possibly place them from the trenches. And these were able to reach little hollows and depressions where the men were entirely safe from the Spanish artillery and from their trench fire. Moreover, in one hollow, which we thought safe, the Spaniards succeeded in dropping a shell, a fragment of which went through the head of one of my men, who, astonishing to say, lived, although unconscious, for 2 hours afterward.
Again, while the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, or Rough Riders, are given much of the credit for the success in Cuba, the key forces fighting for the U.S. in the Spanish-American War are mostly comprised of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. Serving with the African-American fighters of the 10th as quartermaster is 1st Lieutenant John J. Pershing. John Joseph Pershing fights with the 10th Cavalry at Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill and is cited for gallantry, an honor that will later be upgraded to a Silver Star. Pershing is with the Buffalo Soldiers throughout the siege and surrender of Santiago. Born near Laclede, Missouri, a year before the American Civil War, Pershing's father, John Fletcher Pershing, would go on to work as a sutler for the 18th Missouri Volunteer Infantry, while his mother, Anne Elizabeth Thompson, would raise John and his 5 siblings. In 1878, after graduating high school, Pershing works for a few years as a teacher to African American students in his hometown. 1882 sees Pershing applying to the United States Military Academy at West Point. In 1886, Pershing is assigned to Troop L of the 6th U.S. Cavalry and serves with the unit in New Mexico, California, Arizona, and North Dakota, participating in military actions to suppress Indian uprisings throughout the Southwest. In skirmishes with the Apache, Pershing earned a citation for bravery. 3 days after the massacre at Wounded Knee, Pershing and Troop L successfully ward off an attack on the 6th Cavalry's supply wagon, forcing Chief War Eagle and the Lakota tribe into retreat. After being promoted to first lieutenant in October of 1892, Pershing is assigned to command a troop of the 10th Cavalry, the regiment comprised of African-American cavalrymen known as Buffalo Soldiers. In 1897, the association with the Buffalo Soldiers earns Pershing the nickname Black Jack when he is appointed as an instructor at West Point. While the nickname is originally derisive and a result of Pershing's reputation as a strict instructor, the name remains with Pershing for the rest of his career. In the Philippines, after the Spanish-American War, between 1899 and 1913, U.S. forces are deployed to occupy the islands and establish relations with the indigenous Moro tribes, who had resisted both Spanish and American occupation. While many of the American soldiers who had served in the Indian Wars in the southwestern United States lived by the motto, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," and civilized them with a crag, Pershing, stationed in Iligan, pursues diplomatic and friendly relations with the Moros. The Moro people soon embrace Pershing's efforts towards peaceful coexistence in the Philippines.
The Sultan had a surprise for the American Army officer, however. With all the love of the Oriental for ostentation, he created Captain Pershing of the United States Army one of his datos. A dato of the Moro people is not only a prince, but he has certain religious and judicial duties which are very important in their eyes. Pershing had the unusual honor of being the first person not a Mohammedan to have this honor conferred upon him. He did not care particularly about the honor, but it gave him a certain prestige with the natives, of which he could make use in his capacity as governor of the province. The Moros had not recognized the authority of the United States to govern them. All officers entrusted with executive powers worked, therefore, at a disadvantage. Here was an officer, however, empowered by the United States to govern the natives, who at the same time was one of their own datos. Hereditary laws compelled their obedience to him, and they recognized his authority as their judge.
By 1916, Black Jack Pershing is made Major General. In January of that year, near Santa Isabel, Chihuahua, Mexico, a train is held up by the revolutionaries under the order of Pancho Villa. Villa had given orders to attack the train in retaliation for a perceived betrayal on the part of the Americans, but reportedly ordered that no American blood be spilled. The Villistas, however, kill all but one American passenger, mostly employees of the American Smelting and Refining Company. The lone survivor gives the details to the press. Pancho Villa continues to build his army, soon commanding a militia of 500. In March of 1916, Villa ordered 100 of his men to attack the town of Columbus, New Mexico, and seize weapons, horses, and supplies from the 13th Cavalry Regiment stationed there. At 4 in the morning, March 9th, the raiders killed 10 civilians and 8 U.S. soldiers before absconding back to Mexico with horses, mules, machine guns, and ammunition. While the raid is technically a success for Villa's men, they don't escape without dozens of men wounded, over 60 dead, and 5 captured by American cavalrymen. The incident convinces the United States government that a mission into Mexico is necessary for the protection of not only innocents in Mexico, but now for the safety of its own people within U.S. borders. 6 days later, on March 19th, Major General John J. Pershing leads 4,800 troops into Mexico with orders from President Woodrow Wilson to bring back Pancho Villa, dead or alive. For nearly a year, the United States Punitive Expedition doggedly hunts for Pancho Villa, with cavalrymen fighting at many key locations in Chihuahua, Mexico, as well as back home in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. While the Battle of Carrizal proves to be a loss for the United States, as well as a strategic miscalculation, the fighting that takes place only strengthens the reputation of the troops of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, who served in the skirmish. First Sergeant Vance Marchbanks remembers the battle, in particular, the actions of Cavalryman Sergeant Peter Bigstaff.
One of the outstanding heroes of the Carrizal engagement was my friend and comrade Peter Bigstaff, who's now retired and lives in Lexington, Kentucky. He was at that time a sergeant in Troop C. A finer man or braver soldier never lived. A Southerner, John Temple Graves, a well-known writer and newspaper man, in the course of a tribute to the Carrizal fighters wrote, "The black trooper, Sergeant Bigstaff, might have faltered and fled a dozen times, leaving Adair to fight alone, but it never seemed to occur to him. He was a comrade to the last blow. When Adair's broken revolver fell from his hand, the black trooper pressed another into it, and together, shooting in defense, they turned the swooping circle of overwhelming odds before him. The black man fought in deadly shambles, side by side with the white man, following always, fighting always, as his lieutenant fought. And finally, when Adair, literally shot to pieces, fell in his tracks, his last command to his black trooper was to leave him and save his own life. Even then, the heroic Negro paused in the midst of that hell of courage for a final service to his officer. Bearing a charmed life, he'd fought his way out. He saw that Adair had fallen with his head in the water, and with superb loyalty, the black trooper turned and went back to the hailstorm of death, lifted the head of his superior officer out of the water, leaned his head against a tree, and left him there dead with dignity when it was impossible to serve him anymore. There is no finer piece of soldierly devotion and heroic comradeship in the history of modern warfare than that of Henry Adair and the black trooper who fought with him at Carrizal.
It seems that bad intelligence has led Pershing to believe that Villa can be captured at Carrizal, but the U.S. cavalry forces encounter Mexican army forces and ill-advisedly attack anyway. The American forces are driven back, in spite of the valiant effort by the 10th Cavalry, with 2 officers and 14 men killed. The Punitive expedition also becomes the proving ground for a previously novel piece of equipment, the automobile. Several 3/4-ton 1915 GMC Model 15 trucks and motor cars for officers. While the experience proves to be a dry run for the use of automobiles in World War I, many harsh lessons are learned. The rough terrain proves too much to handle for the fledgling vehicles, as many of the GMC trucks are destroyed or abandoned over the 400-mile expedition into Mexico, unable to cope with sandy and muddy conditions. The personnel cars prove unreliable as well. While the vehicles brought with them still do not outperform the cavalry's horses and mules, much is learned about the kinds of logistics and support that will be needed to mount automobiles in a war effort, proving invaluable the following year when the United States becomes embroiled in the First World War. The GMC Model 16 and Model 16 AA's, the latter specially ordered by the U.S. Army, featured improvements that see the vehicles become more reliable and useful on the field of battle, especially for use of supporting aviation efforts and as field ambulances, as a pamphlet published by GMC states,
It is to the credit of the United States government that in every phase of preparation for the Great War, the utmost consideration was given to providing comfort for the soldiers, not only during the preparation term at the various encampments around the country, but in providing for their welfare on the field of battle. It is a source of much satisfaction to the General Motors Truck Company that the Medical Department of the United States Army found the GMC 3/4-ton chassis to meet the requirements of this very exacting service.
As the vehicles continue to improve, other tools of the trade are given enhancements, and a few standby pieces of equipment that are in current use, and some that will soon be in use, are honed and perfected by the man who gives these items their name.
A child starts locomotion by crawling, but on this account, do we discourage walking? The recruit flinches and blinks on first firing a gun, but he is certainly not encouraged to continue this practice. Why then should the ignorant swinging of a sword be indicative of its proper use? It is in the charge that the sword is particularly needful and, in fact, finds almost its whole application, and it is here that the point is of particular advantage in stimulating to the highest degree the desire of closing with the enemy and running him through.
In 1914, Major General Leonard Wood approves the publication and implementation of a manual of saber exercises to be used in conjunction with the cavalry's latest standard sword, the Model 1913 Cavalry Saber, commonly called the Patton sword, after the man who spurs its invention, Second Lieutenant George S. Patton. Patton devised the exercises and tips in his manual from experience. In the 1912 Olympic Games, Patton is chosen as the Army's entry into the first ever pentathlon, where Patton goes on to place 21st on the pistol range, but many reports say that Patton should have been placed much higher, as Patton used a .38 caliber pistol for his target shooting. Many were convinced that the holes in the target were so large and Patton's aim so good that many rounds passed through the same hole twice. The judges disagreed, and they hold their ruling that Patton's subsequent shots missed the target entirely. Patton accepted the ruling and later only commented,
The high spirit of sportsmanship and generosity manifested throughout speaks volumes for the character of the officers of the present day. There was not a single incident of a protest or any unsportsmanlike quibbling or fighting for points which I may say marred some of the other civilian competitions at the Olympic Games. Each man did his best and took what fortune sent them like a true soldier. And at the end, we all felt more like good friends and comrades than rivals in a severe competition. Yet this spirit of friendship in no manner detracted from the zeal with which all strove for success.
Patton is a gentleman on the field of sports as well as on the field of battle. While he remains humble about the shooting competition, the accomplished athlete goes on to place 7th in swimming, 6th in the equestrian competition, 3rd in the foot race, and 4th in fencing. After the Olympics, Patton studies fencing at the cavalry school in Saumur, France. A French master swordsman and instructor at the school, Adjutant Charles Clary, taught Patton well, and he not only returned to America with newly designed rules of engagement with combat sabers, but also with ideas for a newly designed weapon. During the Punitive expedition to Mexico, Patton serves as a personal aide to John J. Pershing, and eventually is given command of Troop C of 13th Cavalry in the continuing effort to capture Pancho Villa and his fighters. On May 14, 1916, Patton leads a small force of about 12 men on a foraging mission in 3 Dodge touring cars. The convoy surprises and kills 3 of Pancho Villa's men. It was not only the beginning of Patton's fascination with and implementation of motorized vehicles in combat, but it was the surprise attack that was the first motorized battle in U.S. military history.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting. Invoking the spirit of our forefathers, the Army asks your unflinching support to the end that the high ideals for which America stands may endure upon the earth.
In 1917, the United States enters what is then called the Great War, a conflict that had been raging in Europe for nearly 3 years. Initially, no cavalry units are deployed, but the newly formed 15th Cavalry Division at Fort Sam Houston still winds up supporting the American military in Europe. The units comprising the 15th Cavalry are subsequently trained not in cavalry tactics, but in field artillery support. The newly dubbed 7th Field Artillery supported the regular U.S. Army as a part of the 1st Expeditionary Division, which is later designated as simply the 1st Division, part of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War I. While the cavalry, for the most part, operates only in the United States during the First World War, a few storied leaders of the cavalry are now presented with the opportunity to lead soldiers overseas. Joining the American Expeditionary Forces once again as aide to General Blackjack Pershing is Captain George Patton. In May of 1917, Patton begins his campaign in Europe by overseeing the training of American troops in Paris before being stationed at Chaumont to act as an adjutant, overseeing the operations of the base. Patton finds the post dissatisfying, and while stationed at Chaumont, Patton begins to take an interest in a new form of motorized artillery, tanks. Pershing intended to place Patton in charge of an infantry battalion, but while in the hospital for jaundice, Patton meets Colonel Fox Connor, who convinces Patton to pursue his interest in tanks by establishing the American Expeditionary Forces Light Tank Corps and attending the French Army's tank training school. Patton gains more experience than any other soldier by driving a Renault FT light tank and studying the results of one of the first large-scale battles to use tanks, the British-led offensive at Cambrai, France. Soon after Patton established his tank corps, he is promoted to general and receives the first 10 tanks as they are delivered to the tank school in Langres, France, in March of 1918. Because Patton was the only soldier with experience driving tanks, the general himself personally drove 7 of the tanks off of the train on which they had arrived. At Langres, Patton is in charge of not only training infantrymen to become tank crews, but promoting the use of tanks themselves. At first, the infantry is reluctant to adopt the tank for warfare. But by the end of the Great War, however, the United States Army is more than convinced. Patton goes on to lead tank brigades into battle at Saint-Mihiel, the first battle that sees American tank units, and also into Essay and Pan. At some of the battles, Patton is so confident in the tank's power that the now lieutenant colonel either led the tanks on foot into the fields of battle or rode exposed on the tops of the machines. His orders are that no tank is to ever be surrendered. Supporting the U.S. First Corps in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in late September 1918, Patton is wounded in an attack on German machine guns stationed near Chepi, and continues to command his troops from a hole left in the battlefield by tank shells until he's evacuated. Patton, however, refuses admittance to the hospital before he can give his briefing to a rear command post. For his actions at Sheppey, Patton is promoted to colonel and given the Distinguished Service Medal, and later a Purple Heart after that medal was instated in 1932. The wound sidelines Patton for the rest of the Great War, but the tanks roll on. As World War I reaches armistice, the United States and other allies continue to develop their tank technology and construction, with the U.S. building and experimenting with light and medium-sized tanks. In the period between World Wars I and II, the cavalry, and indeed the whole of the American armed forces, undergoes massive restructuring. In 1921, the Army establishes a permanent cavalry division and lays out tables of organization and equipment on April 21st. The newly formed 1st Cavalry Division was in fact merely an amalgam of previously established units, some dating back to before the American Civil War. As an official 1st Cavalry history explains, the division's roots date back to 1855, when the 2nd Cavalry Regiment was organized. Redesignated as the 5th Cavalry in 1861, this unit participated in a number of famous Civil War engagements, including Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, Wilderness, and Appomattox. The sound of the bugle and the cry of "Charge!" sent the thundering hooves of U.S. cavalry troopers to protect the western-bound settlers in an era when Indians roamed the western frontier and pioneering settlers clung to their land with determination and luck. As the previously established regiments come together, headquartered at Fort Bliss, Texas, and Douglas, Arizona, both old, such as the 5th Cavalry, and new, such as the 15th Cavalry, are reorganized into a square division consisting of headquarters, 2 cavalry brigades, a field artillery battalion, an engineer battalion, quartermaster trains command, special troops command, and an ambulance corps. In September of 1921, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry are transferred into the 1st Cavalry Division, but Jim Crow laws of the time prevented black and white soldiers from serving in the same units. The 10th were soon replaced by the 5th Cavalry Regiment. As the cavalry and the rest of the military undergo an overhaul, the use of cavalry tactics and practices make their way into other branches of the armed forces. Initially part of the Quartermaster Corps, the U.S. Army Remount Service breeds, trains, and provides horses for all cavalry and U.S. Army units that require them, first starting to systematically breed horses for the cavalry in 1918.
The mission of the Remount Service is as follows. A. The purchase of horses and mules and forage for the Army. B. The care, conditioning, and training of remounts after purchase and before issue. C. The distribution and issue of remounts. D. Organization and operation of the Remount Service. E. The training, allocation, and assignment of Remount Service personnel operating under the control of the Quartermaster General. And F. The operation of the Army Horse Breeding Plan.
The Remount Service traces its roots, however, to the American Civil War, where 2 organizations are established for the furnishing of horses, one to the cavalry and one to field artillery. The organizations are not adequately staffed or led, leading to many problems with not only training of the horses, but corruption and command stability. Activated in 1908, changes were made not only in processing and distribution of the horses and mules, but an effort is also made to enlist breeders and sellers themselves as an official element of the service. Thoroughbred, Arabian, Morgan, Saddlebreds, Anglo-Arabians, and Cleveland Bay breeds of horses are all successfully bred and trained through 1945. Several remount depots were established in Nebraska, Texas, Montana, Oklahoma, California, Louisiana, and Virginia. By 1944, however, the number of remount outposts is reduced to 6, as the advent of automobiles and tanks lessened the need of horses and mules by the military. As the United States military comes of age during the years leading up to World War II, it is increasingly clear that the days of the mounted cavalrymen are numbered. Before the United States entered World War II, the cavalry's units were designated as either horse-mounted or mechanized. As the war raged on, the mechanized units all ultimately reveal themselves as the future of the United States Cavalry. The final horse-mounted cavalry charge takes place on June 16, 1942. Fighting Japanese forces in the Patton Peninsula, in the Philippines, the 26th Cavalry Regiment enters battle with the Japanese in the village of Morong. The fighting devastates the American and Philippine forces, and tragically, the 26th Cavalry must resort to slaughtering their horses for food. The beleaguered unit continues fighting and foraging on foot, scavenging supplies, weapons, and vehicles until they are forced to surrender to the enemy. A 1966 notice in the weekly Washington, D.C. newspaper, The Pentagram, profiles a distinguished member of the United States Cavalry and one who had served with the African American soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, more specifically, a cavalry horse named Chief.
March 24, 1966. Chief, the last living cavalry horse still carried on government rolls, was foaled in 1932 and purchased by the Army in 1940 at Fort Robertson, Nebraska. In December of 1949, he was placed in semi-retirement and was fully retired at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1958. In the event of his death, Chief will be buried with full military honors adjacent to Old Trooper, the cavalry monument on Main Post. Chief, the last remaining government-owned cavalry horse, is currently in retirement at Fort Riley, Kansas. Though the days of the horse cavalry have long since passed, this horse remains on the Army rolls. Foaled in 1932, the Bay entered the Army 8 years later, exactly 1 year and 12 days prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He arrived at his cavalry post, Fort Riley, Kansas, on April 3, 1941, where he was assigned to the 10th Cavalry and later the 9th Cavalry. In June of 1942, Chief was transferred to the Cavalry School and remained on the post until his retirement.
The Army had experimented with regiments that were both horse-mounted and mechanized, but World War II proves that the advantages lie in cavalry tank and artillery brigades. Mechanized cavalry units are each equipped with 6 Bantam Jeeps, 3 of which are armed with mounted 60mm mortars, and the other 3 mounted with 30 or 50 caliber machine guns. The units are also outfitted with 3 M8 Greyhound armored cars, a 6-wheeled lightweight armored vehicle with a 37mm gun, mounted in a 360-degree capable turret. The Greyhounds were also equipped with powerful FM radios, ensuring superior battlefield communications for the Allies. Light tank units are comprised of a total of 17 tanks. First, an M3 Stuart, then with M5 Stuarts. The tanks, like the M8s, housed 37mm guns and were fast and maneuverable. However, the armor plating process proves inadequate against German tanks, prompting all Stuarts to be replaced with M24 Chaffee light tanks sporting 75mm guns. The successes and failures of the armored cavalry divisions provide trial-by-fire data for the United States military. Soon, the American Armed Forces would begin incorporating armored and tank cavalry units to support almost all other branches of the military. Not only does the cavalry continue to improve upon its own tactics and technology, but we have seen the cavalry successfully integrate itself in some form with other units across many branches of the United States military. From the remount service to tank battalions, cavalry service to the American military will soon extend to Air Cavalry, first being deployed during the conflict in Vietnam. Beyond the technology of warfare, great leaders like Generals Pershing and Patton have risen through the ranks to become some of the most powerful and effective leaders in the United States military history. And Vice President Theodore Roosevelt became the leader of the free world in 1901 when President William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt went on to serve 2 more terms as president in his own right, continuing to not only command with the highest honor, but to capture the imagination of the American people, much as he had done during his service with the U.S. Cavalry leading his Rough Riders. We will explore new innovations, new hopes, and new leaders who rise as we continue with the history of the United States Cavalry.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation.
In 1941, the United States has little choice but to declare war on Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor removes any doubt that World War II would be resolved without the intervention of U.S. military forces. Now, seemingly a mainstay of the American military, the United States Cavalry, at the outbreak of World War II, consists of 6 organized reserve cavalry divisions, 4 National Guard, and 3 regular divisions. The need for horse cavalry is continually questioned as American forces gear up for war with the Axis powers. However, the 2nd Cavalry Division is deactivated, and its members are chosen to form the 9th Armored Division. This Phantom Division, as the 9th came to be known, effectively guards the Luxembourg border from German attacks, even though the German units usually outnumbered the armored units 5 men to 1. The Phantom Division is awarded with a Presidential Unit Citation, in particular for their actions during the Battle of Remagen, in which the Ludendorff Bridge was saved, just moments before demolition. Not only do the members of the 9th defend this position from further German attacks, but the bridge itself came in handy for use in crossing the Lahn River into Limburg, where the Phantom Division frees thousands of Allied prisoners. Their citation tells the harrowing story of the defense of the Ludendorff Bridge. Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, is cited for outstanding performance of duty in action from the 28th of February to March the 9th, 1945, in Germany. On the 28th of February, Combat Command B launched an attack from the vicinity of Sola, and less than 24 hours later, crossed the Erft River at Derkum. Forcing the enemy into disorderly retreat, the unit headed southeast, reaching the heights west of Remagen on the 7th of March, where troops of the command could see the Ludendorff Bridge across the Rhine River with large numbers of German troops fleeing across it. At 1500 hours that day, a prisoner was captured who revealed that the bridge was mined for demolition and was to be destroyed at 1600 hours. At 1535 hours, one column of Combat Company B reached the western approach of the bridge. The span was still intact. Although the destruction of the bridge was imminent, American troops unhesitatingly rushed across the structure in the face of intense enemy automatic weapons fire. An explosion rocked the bridge, but did not destroy it. Engineers scrambled down the abutments, cutting wires leading to other demolition charges and disposing of hundreds of pounds of explosives by hurling them into the river. Bulldozer tanks, working under heavy artillery and small arms fire, filled craters at the bridge's approach to permit vehicular passage. Upon reaching the opposite bank, troops of Combat Command B fought gallantly and cleared the surrounding high ground. Although the strength of the span was unknown, tank units rumbled across the bridge after dark and lent their support to the foot troops. Anti-aircraft artillerymen deployed their weapons so skillfully that in the ensuing days, numerous enemy airplanes were destroyed in vain attempts to demolish the bridge. The superb skill, daring, and esprit de corps displayed by each officer and man of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, in their dash to the Rhine, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, and the successful exploitation of this first bridgehead across Germany's formidable river barrier made an outstanding contribution to the defeat of the enemy. While the cavalry itself is on uncertain ground at the start of World War II, its methods and skills are put to use by many other units of the American military. Armored, mechanized, and even horse cavalry do play a role in the United States plan of attack. But in the Pacific, a 24-year-old lieutenant would wind up leading what became the final horse-mounted charge led by the United States Cavalry. Edwin Price Ramsey, a graduate of the Oklahoma Military Academy, enters into active service with the 11th Cavalry Reserve in February of 1941. Commissioned as a second lieutenant, in June of that year, Ramsey volunteers with the 26th Cavalry Regiment, an elite unit made up of regular Army officers and Filipino soldiers stationed in the Philippine Islands. The 26th, also called the Philippine Scouts, while much smaller in size than a regular cavalry unit, is nevertheless judged by Price to be probably as fine, if not the finest, regiment the U.S. Army had. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan invades the Philippines, and in response, the 26th Cavalry Regiment is deployed as part of the North Luzon Force in an effort to defend the Lingayen Gulf area from landings by Japanese soldiers. American and Filipino forces are soon outnumbered by wave after wave of landing Japanese, and as Allied forces retreat into Bataan, the 26th Cavalry provides the cover fire and support as American and Filipino troops withdraw. January 15, 1942, Philippine Scouts Troop E is ordered to move toward the village of Morong as an advanced guard. Lieutenant Ramsey, in charge of Troop G, offered assistance to Troop E. Ramsey and his Filipino soldiers knew the area well, and even though his unit was scheduled for R&R, Ramsey later stated that he did the one thing they never tell you to do in the Army: volunteer. Ramsey then leads 3 mounted squadrons into the jungle towards Morong. The 27-man teams encounter Japanese infantry at the village and proceed to successfully fight off the enemy soldiers and hold the town of Morong in what would be the last mounted cavalry charge led on horseback. Only 3 casualties are suffered by the Allies, and Lieutenant Ramsey suffers a mortar wound. While the historic charge keeps Japanese forces at bay temporarily, sadly, the surviving horses are slaughtered when the squadrons run out of food. Discouraged and disheveled, Ramsey and some of his men escape the surrender of Bataan, in which Japanese captors lead POWs on what became known as the Bataan Death March, in which an estimated 21,600 American and Filipino prisoners perish. In a 2001 special session of Congress honoring the veterans of the Bataan Death March, United States Representative Dana Rohrabacher recounts the experiences of the POWs.
They were beaten and they were starved as they marched. Those who fell were bayoneted. Some of those who fell were beheaded by Japanese officers who were practicing with their samurai swords from horseback. The Japanese culture at that time reflected the view that any warrior who surrendered had no honor, thus was not to be treated like a human being. Thus they were not committing crimes against human beings. The Japanese soldiers at that time felt they were dealing with subhumans and animals.
After his escape, Lieutenant Ramsey goes on to form and lead guerrilla forces for the next 3 years. Ramsey and over 40,000 Americans and Filipinos fight against Japanese soldiers and communist hook guerrillas in an effort to prepare for the return of General Douglas MacArthur to the island. In addition to covert missions against enemies on Luzon Island, including the Kempate, the Japanese secret police, Ramsey sent vital intelligence to General MacArthur himself. Ramsey's observations and judgment on the character of their Japanese enemies later proves instrumental upon MacArthur's return and the United States victory in the Pacific. In this memo to MacArthur, Ramsey describes the indiscriminate violence perpetrated by the Japanese upon not only their combatants, but civilians as well.
Memo to MacArthur from Edwin Price Ramsey, 16 December 1944. More atrocities committed indiscriminately. No distinctions made between innocent civilians and guerrillas. Similar atrocities occurred during zonifications, currently done either by districts, blocks, or streets at any hour. Others including women brutally beaten, hand grenades thrown at civilians in groups. 10th and 11th December. About 300 executed without investigation. Males lined up at public plazas, ordered to run, and shot in the back while running.
While Ramsey may have led the final horse cavalry charge of the United States Cavalry branch, his work as a part of the Philippine Scouts, and later as a part of the guerrilla resistance, only proves that even a short time serving with the cavalry had made Ramsey an incomparable soldier. Ramsey is a hero to the Filipino people, and for his 3 years of service on the island nation, the Filipino government awards Lieutenant Ramsey their Medal of Honor, the Philippine Distinguished Conduct Star, the Distinguished Service Star, and many other decorations. General MacArthur personally awards Ramsey the Distinguished Service Cross, in addition to promoting Ramsey to Lieutenant Colonel. The United States also rewards Ramsey with the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and 3 Presidential Unit citations. In 1945, Ramsey returns to the United States, welcomed by a letter from his Commander-in-Chief, Harry S. Truman.
July 14, 1945. It gives me special pleasure to welcome you back to your native shores and to express, on behalf of the people of the United States, the joy we feel at your deliverance from the hands of the enemy. It is a source of profound satisfaction that our efforts to accomplish your return have been successful. You have fought valiantly in foreign lands and have suffered greatly. As your Commander-in-Chief, I take pride in your past achievements and express the thanks of a grateful nation for your services in combat and your steadfastness while a prisoner of war. May God grant you happiness and early return to health. Harry S. Truman.
While 1944 sees Lieutenant Ramsey leading guerrillas against the Japanese in the Pacific, mechanized cavalry units like the 106th Cavalry Regiment used its advanced armor vehicles and light tanks to provide reconnaissance to armored and infantry divisions in the European theater of World War II. Equipped with armored vehicles and light tanks, the 106th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron fights in France, Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg. Utilizing Bantam Jeeps with mounted 30 to 50 caliber machine guns, M8 Greyhound armored cars with a 360-degree turret mounted 37mm gun, units of the 106th are often the first into battle, engaging in scouting and sometimes reconnaissance fire. Mobile artillery is supplied by the E Troop, consisting of 3 assault gun platoons with 75mm howitzers mounted without a turret on an M8 chassis. E Troop also carries supplies and ammunition in 2 half-track vehicles, providing a mobile headquarters on the battlefield. F Troop consists of 5 light tank companies. Until 1945, each company is outfitted with 5 37mm M5A1 Stuart light tanks. The Stuart tank proves maneuverable and fast, but its armor plating is found to be insufficient against shells fired from German tanks. In February of 1945, the units upgrade to 75mm M24 Chaffee light tanks. The larger gun levels the field of battle against the Germans. The 106th Cavalry Commander Colonel Venard Wilson, speaking to his unit on Memorial Day, 1945, at St. Wolfgang, Austria, had this to say to his men.
That, from a tactical standpoint, was one of the most interesting and successful of our accomplishments. An entire German division, the 16th Infantry Division, was in front of us. Our communications and technique were then developed to such a high standard that our infantry following us hardly lost an hour. We used 5 or 6 troops to contain those Germans, slipped around to their north, and delivered our infantry on their objective at 5 in the afternoon after a 50-mile advance. I wish to pay special tribute to B Troop 106 Squadron and their gallant troop commander, Captain Park, in this operation. This troop was 100 miles in the rear of us when the advance was ordered, came up during the night, arrived at the starting point after the other troops had departed, kept moving as rear troop during the day, and were sent into action late in the afternoon after I had committed the 5 other troops. Captain Park used one of his platoons on side blocking and reconnaissance missions. And when I arrived at Sharma, we had only Captain Park, 2 platoons, and a platoon of tanks. It was enough to do the job.
The 106th's actions in France, and especially those of the 121st Cavalry Squadron, garner Wilson the Legion of Merit, Legion of Honor, and the Croix de Guerre for outstanding leadership during the cavalry's actions. French General Charles de Gaulle himself issued a citation that praised the 106th for their gallantry and bravery in battle as they fought alongside the 2nd French Division in the Vosges Mountains.
A magnificent regiment whose brilliant achievements during the time in which it fought with and in support of the 2nd French Armored Division from 20 August 1944 to 10 February 1945 command the highest admiration. In the conduct of these operations, the 106th Cavalry Group USA showed a tenacity and vigor worthy of the greatest praise, never allowing itself to be cut off, even when it was engaged with a determined enemy force superior in numbers to its own, successfully accomplishing all the missions assigned to it, persistently seeking contact when the enemy concealed himself. This regiment has proven itself possessed of the highest military attributes and of a combat proficiency without equal.
Though the cavalry is unsure about its place at the beginning of World War II, the strides being made in France and throughout the European theater during the war make it very clear. The cavalry's mix of tried and true reconnaissance tactics and battlefield strategies blend very well with the technological advances of armored vehicles and tanks. And while mechanized and heavily armed victory on the battlefield signals a new era in cavalry fighting, the over century-old tactics developed by the United States Army Cavalry Scouts also still remain integral to the Allies' victory in Europe and in the Pacific. While mechanized and tank branches of the Cavalry and Armored Division prove themselves as distinct advantages on the battlefields of World War II, Cavalry Scouts, in use by Americans since the Revolutionary War, still serve in their role as the eyes and ears of command. As early as 1775, Cavalry Scouts provide reconnaissance on enemy movements and fortifications, as well as reports on conditions of terrain and even the weather. Scouts serve as navigators on the battlefield, in addition to their myriad other duties. Cavalry Scouts are required to possess a staggering number of common and specialized skills, even at the lowest of ranks, and scouting units are some of the tightest knit groups active in the military. In 1942, the cavalry's initial role during World War II was that of border patrol, as it had been during much of World War I. The United States military reasons that fighting in Europe will be better served with tanks and mechanized cavalry, since access to roads and fuel and forgiving terrain is not an issue. Still, even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. has no clear plan for response to an attack in the Western Hemisphere. Any enemy landing in Germany-sympathizing Mexico or Brazil would be better met by a squad of cavalry whose horses can cover difficult obstacles and can traverse the rugged landscapes of the Southwest in the United States, Central America, and even South America with relative ease in comparison to cars or tanks. In the summer of 1942, at a location near Mansfield, Louisiana, the 3rd Army Louisiana maneuvers are held from August 4th through September 19th. Ideas from the cavalry and cavalry scouts are further developed as the maneuvers test new aerial artillery recon techniques, anti-tank units, and the addition of armored vehicles to scout units. While the maneuvers involve more troops than in previous years, command is held by experienced reserve cavalry commanders, well-versed in combat on horseback. The leaders welcome motor vehicles into the fold with relative ease, integrating and soon passing on to armored cars and tanks the generations of cavalry experience in winning a battle with horse and wagon. The year after the maneuvers, the 91st Reconnaissance Squadron is deployed to North Africa to prepare for battle with Germany and Italy, as well as to fortify the Allies' position in preparation for the invasion of Southern Europe. Cavalry units are also dispatched to New Guinea and other areas of the Pacific. There, cavalry reconnaissance experts, like the Code Talkers, members of the 302nd Reconnaissance Troop, who hailed from the Lakota and Dakota Indian tribes, who used their native language as an unbreakable code to baffle any Japanese or German forces who might have been listening in. The cavalry scouts provide intelligence and support techniques that are still used to this day. During World War II, while actual horse cavalry may have been coming to an end, the tactics and strategies perfected by nearly a century of United States cavalrymen are utilized by many other units outside the cavalry proper. World War II sees the United States military benefiting from the cavalry's examples, honed by decades of victory through intelligence, firepower, and sterling leadership. One such leader and true battlefield innovator will come to define a generation of soldiers, serving as a high watermark to which other generals would be compared. The cavalry has him to thank for advances not only in their traditional saber, but for the advocacy and development of tank warfare. George Smith Patton wastes no time preparing for war. When World War II erupts in Europe in 1939, he seeks to build and maintain an armored fighting force.
When I want my men to remember something important, to really make it stick, I give it to them double dirty. It may not sound nice to some bunch of little old ladies at an afternoon tea party, but it helps my soldiers to remember. You can't run an army without profanity, and it has to be eloquent profanity. An army without profanity couldn't fight its way out of a piss-soaked paper bag. As for the types of comments I make, sometimes I just, by God, get carried away with my own eloquence.
During the war, General Patton became almost as famous for his brash personality as for his relentless pursuit of the right people, tactics, weapons, and technology that would win the war for the Allies. Patton led Army, cavalry, and armored units throughout the war and in a number of different locales, such as Algerian French Morocco, North Africa, Tunisia, Sicily, Lorraine, Ardennes, the Rhineland, and the Central Europe campaign. Patton poured himself into his duties even before the United States officially entered the war. In December of 1940, now Major General Patton led maneuvers by the U.S. 1st Armored Corps in a massive operation that sees 1,000 tanks and vehicles mobilizing from Columbus, Georgia to Panama City, Florida, and back again. While on this assignment, Patton even earns his pilot's license in order to better observe the armored troops' movements from the air. Ruthlessly efficient, Patton also leads the 1st Armored in June 1941 during the Tennessee maneuvers, where 48 hours worth of planned objectives are accomplished in an astounding 9 hours. Ever a proponent for striking fast and hard on the battlefield, in 1944, Patton responds to one war correspondent's question about whether or not to slow down the Third Army's rapid offensive in order to spare U.S. lives.
Whenever you slow anything down, you waste human lives.
While Patton's predilection for rapid offensive movements earns him the nickname Old Blood and Guts, he is still widely admired by those under his command. Among his men, he is affectionately called the Old Man, unquestionably the man in charge. Commanding the Western Task Force in Casablanca, Morocco in 1942, Patton's 33,000 men meet resistance from Vichy French soldiers, but soon successfully land and conquer the city on November 11, 1942, 2 days after their arrival. Casablanca is soon repurposed as a military port under the oversight of Major General Patton. The Sultan of Morocco holds Patton in high esteem, awarding him the Order of Wissam Aloït, the citation reading, "The lions in their dens tremble at his approach." The Sultan's opinion is proven correct later in the war. In 1944, the rumors about Patton are legion. It is said that no one holds Old Blood and Guts in higher regard than the German High Command. The Allies exploit this very well in an intelligence operation known as Operation Fortitude. German spies are fed a host of misinformation, including that Patton had been named commander of the 1st United States Army Group, and that the unit was preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais in northern France. Germany's 15th Army stationed itself at Pas-de-Calais, while the Allies' real operation went into effect, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. In reality, Patton did not fly into France until a month later, as Patton was on assignment commanding and training the Third Army in England, a unit that had newly arrived. General Eisenhower gives this command to Patton after a series of incidents that call into question Patton's leadership. In August of 1943, 2 different privates, Charles H. Kuhl and Paul G. Bennett, were slapped and verbally abused by Patton after the men had been found to suffer from battle fatigue. Patton is incensed by the men, mistaking their fatigue for cowardice. He issues orders for his commanders to similarly discipline any soldier making such complaints. While the slapping incidents prompted a private disciplinary action from Eisenhower, who ordered Patton to apologize to the men he had accosted, they only solidified Patton as a general who wanted to win the war at any cost. Still, Eisenhower and other top military brass knew Patton was an invaluable asset to the American Army, and the successful espionage of Operation Fortitude proves that Patton could theoretically win battles on his reputation alone. In a speech to the Third Army on June 5, 1944, the day before the invasion at Normandy, Patton espoused his strong belief in the American soldier as a winner above all, but did acknowledge that even the greatest generals experience fear. Fear would be plentiful, after all, on D-Day.
All real Americans love the sting and clash of battle. You are here today for 3 reasons. First, because you are here to defend your homes and your loved ones. Second, you are here for your own self-respect, because you would not want to be anywhere else. Third, you are here because you are real men, and all real men like to fight. Americans love a winner. Americans will not tolerate a loser. Americans despise cowards. Americans play to win all of the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost, nor will ever lose a war. For the very idea of losing is hateful to an American.
While not without his personal flaws, Patton is remembered best as a ruthless general and a colorful and talented orator, capable of drawing out the best in all those he led. His influence on cavalry tactics, armored warfare, and military leadership is still in practice today, and shortly after his death in 1945, the United States Army adopts many of Patton's strategies for use in their training exercises. In his earliest days as a cavalryman, Patton's expert swordsmanship leads to the crafting of the Patton saber, which comes to be the standard issue sword for the United States Cavalry in the early 20th century, shortly before the First World War. It is fitting, then, that after World War II, the United States would name its newest design tank after the storied general. The M46 Patton medium tank, mounted with a 90mm M3A1 gun and boasting 4-inch thick armor, would become the Army's standard issue tank, used primarily in Korea and maintained as a powerful defense tool throughout the Cold War. While Patton's innovations in the field of weaponry, armored vehicles, and tanks propel the United States Armed Forces forward as a leading contender on any battlefield, much of his insight can be attributed to the traditions and tactics that he learned in the United States Cavalry. One such tradition survives from the cavalry's days fighting in the Civil War on horseback, on through to World War II, when the cavalry fights with armored vehicles and tanks. From the earliest eras of warfare, flags carried into battle served both figurative and practical instruments on the field of battle, both identifying and inspiring the troops of a certain company with a simple, strong image, and also serving as a rallying point to locating your own company on the battlefield. Cavalry guidons are another example of tradition and esprit de corps used in a useful, practical manner in warfare. A swallow-tailed flag measuring 20 inches by 27 inches and marked with numbers designating troops of regiments and squadrons. The word guidon comes from the Italian guidone for marker or guide. Starting in 1861, Army regulations state that infantry regiments carry both flags representing national colors and regimental colors. The nearly 6-foot square standards prove unwieldy for carrying on horseback, so cavalry develops regimental standards of 2 by 2 feet, in addition to the guidons carried by individual companies. While carrying his personal guidon, one stripe of red and blue with sabers crossing in the center, General George Custer charged into the ill-fated Battle of Little Bighorn under the guidon of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Even into the 21st century, the 7th Cavalry fly the swallow-tailed guidon and refer to themselves as Custer's Own. The colors can be seen in 2003 as the cavalry leads the charge into the war to liberate Iraq. This tradition endures alongside the tactics and the honor of the United States Cavalry. In March of 1918, the 65th Engineers at Camp Meade are redesignated as the Tank Corps, National Army, and under the command of Colonel Ira Clinton Wellborn. They begin their training on the Gettysburg battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The unit continues its development and training throughout the following year across the United States at Camp Polk, Camp Benning, and Camp Meade. After armistice in 1919, former cavalryman John J. Pershing recommends to Congress that the Tank Corps become an adjunct of the infantry. In 1920, as the National Army is disbanded, 2 heavy and 4 light tank battalions were absorbed by the infantry. 20 years later, in 1940, as the United States prepares for the possibility of entering World War II in Europe, the Armored Force is formed on July 10, 1940. Even though the tank and armored branches are formed from cavalry units, the Army Reorganization Act of 1950 dictates that the remaining cavalry units be absorbed by the armored branch. The reorganization takes full effect in 1951, the year after the United States ended war with North Korea. When North Korea suddenly attacks the Republic of Korea on June 25, 1950, the U.S. Army is weak in tanks, and its units initially enter combat in Korea without them. The 7th, 24th, and 25th Infantry Divisions, and the 1st Cavalry Division, organized as infantry, all on occupational duty in Japan, had assigned to them the 77th, 78th, 79th, and 71st Tank Battalions, respectively. But only one company, Company A, of each battalion, has been organized, and those companies have only M24 light tanks. Heavier tanks, it is feared, will damage the Japanese-made roads and bridges. Although the rugged terrain in Korea had been considered generally unsuitable for tank deployment, Russian-made T-34s are used with success by the North Koreans during the early days of the war. American tanks are rushed to the scene in support of the United Nations, and they engage in their first combat on July 10, 1950. For several weeks, they are outnumbered. And it is not until late August that the tank balance in Korea was tipped in favor of the United Nations. By then, more than 500 U.S. tanks are in the Pusan perimeter, outnumbering the enemy's tanks by over 5 to 1. For the remainder of the war, tank units of battalion size and smaller are present in most of the combat actions. The U.S. employs light and medium tanks during the fighting in Korea. The first tanks to enter the fray were the M24 Chaffee light tank. Carrying a 75mm primary armament and an additional 50 caliber Browning machine gun, the Chaffee had been in service since the latter days of World War II. Their primary opponent on the battlefield, the North Korean T-34-85s, had the Chaffee not only out-armed and out-armored, but many of the American M24 tanks are crewed by troops having been reassigned from post-World War II occupational duties in Japan. As such, the inexperienced crews serve as one more detriment to the success of the M24 Chaffee in Korea. Later in the war, the Chaffee proves more effective in a reconnaissance role, supported by heavier tanks. However, the M24 Chaffee's initial failures on the battlefield has the United States scrambling for a solution. Development had begun on the M41 Walker Bulldog in 1949. In their rush to aid the M24 in Korea, the Bulldog winds up merely using the conflict as a testing ground. While the tank is well armed and maneuverable, its engine is an overly loud gas guzzler, and the sheer weight of the Bulldog causes problems transporting the tank by air. The two medium tanks that see the most use in Korea both bear the names of legendary cavalrymen. Named for General John Blackjack Pershing, the M26 Pershing medium tank is designed and produced following World War II. Initially designed as a heavy tank, Army regulations and new requirements for heavy tanks in 1946 see the Pershing redesignated as a medium tank. While the firepower and armor are superior to the M4 Sherman it replaces, the M26 Pershing proves lacking in its mobility. In 1950, to aid the Chaffees and Pershing tanks, the M46 Patton medium tanks arrive in South Korea. At 44 metric tons with armor up to 4 inches thick, the M46 Patton is also armed with a 90mm M3A1, a 50 caliber M2 machine gun, and 2 30 caliber M1919A4 machine guns. The Pattons proved to be a worthwhile adversary to the North Korean T-3485s, and 200 M46 Pattons are on the ground in Korea by the end of 1950. Though Pershing tanks initially outnumber the Pattons, by the end of 1951, the Pershings are all withdrawn from combat. Now that tanks and other armored vehicles have all but replaced horses, even in cavalry reconnaissance actions, recon, transport, and sustained suppression fire from the air become a priority for the United States in 1965. In June of that year, the Department of Defense authorizes the creation of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. Much of the focus in developing air cavalry is on mobility. Many advisors believed that lack of mobility in the Korean War led to the protraction and stalemate of the war, and French forces in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu suffered the same. Increased mobility through helicopters, like the C-47 transport, means stronger logistical and medical support, aerial command posts providing flexible and more informed command, and an advantage over ground maneuverability. The harsh jungle conditions in Vietnam made travel on the ground challenging, but air transport and gunships clear such hurdles with ease. From the very early 1960s, American military advisors have been present in Vietnam to aid the South Vietnamese forces as they were fighting against the invading communist North Vietnamese. With the U.S. troop count increasing year by year, former President Dwight Eisenhower pushed for an outright declaration of war in a 1967 speech to Republican congressmen.
With 450,000 U.S. troops now in Vietnam, it is time that Congress decide whether or not to declare a state of war exists with North Vietnam. Previous congressional resolutions of support provide only limited authority. Although Congress may decide that the previously approved resolution on Vietnam given President Johnson is sufficient, the issue of a declaration of war should at least be put before the Congress for decision.
By the time the governments of the Western world begin to cast their worried gaze upon the situation in Vietnam in the early 1960s, the United States Cavalry has evolved into a completely motorized and mechanized fighting force on land, and will soon establish its air cavalry tactics. Tanks and other armored vehicles used in World War I, World War II, and in the conflict in Korea have been improved upon in such a way as to establish armored cavalry and other armored branches of the military as mainstays. Soon, we will see not only cavalry and army forces making use of armored attack vehicles on the ground, but also in the air. As the United States enters battle in Vietnam and later conflicts in the Middle East, the legend of the cavalry continues to be written as the introduction of the helicopter extends the reach of armored cavalry vehicles. But even as the cavalry embraces the future of technological capabilities, which traditions will remain unshaken? We shall soon see that many aspects in the culture of the United States Cavalry endure to the present day.
was slow in joining with those who recommended the introduction of ground forces in South Vietnam, but it became perfectly clear something had to be done.
General Maxwell Taylor, a four-star general and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President John F. Kennedy, reflects on his reluctance and eventual conviction about the Vietnam War. In the mid-1960s, the United States is facing some hard choices in regards to the situation in Vietnam. Forces from the People's Army of North Vietnam seek to unify the country under communist rule, while the U.S. military has provided South Vietnam with military advisors, equipment, vehicles, and limited troop support. The question still remains: will the United States enter into a full-scale war with North Vietnam? With the United States Cavalry's new designations and capabilities, many are of the mind that the U.S. might hold an advantage over the North Vietnamese. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile, also called the 1st Air Cavalry Division, is organized in 1965. By using helicopters, the unit is now capable of using the vehicles for a variety of battlefield applications, such as large-scale troop movements, cargo lifts, medevacs, and aerial rocket and machine gun artillery. Ideally, Air Cavalry units lifted the burden on infantry units, who would have had to navigate the harsh jungle terrain in Vietnam on foot. But will the cavalry's new capabilities be sufficient to secure victory in Vietnam?
If you went to the CIA and said, "How is the situation in South Vietnam?" I think they would say it's worse. You see it in the desertion rate. You see it in the morale. You see it in the difficulty to recruit people. You see it in the gradual loss of population control. Many of us in private would say that things are not good. They've gotten worse.
The 1st Air Cavalry Division makes its first flights under its newest designation during the Vietnam War. But in 1951, the United States military first uses helicopters for airlift and medevac operations during the Korean War. On September 13, 1951, a battalion of United States Marines are tasked with clearing enemy combatants from the area surrounding an extinct volcano, referred to by the Marines as the Punch Bowl. During Operation Windmill No. 1, the Marines utilized 7 HRS-1 helicopters to deliver over 18,000 pounds of supplies and evacuate over 70 seriously wounded soldiers. The HRS-1 helicopters used by the Marines during Operation Windmill are a version of the H-19 Chickasaw line of helicopters, especially built for the Marines. Beginning in 1951 in Korea, the H-19 undergoes live service tests on the battlefield. Operating under the 6th Transportation Company, the Chickasaw, as an unarmed transport helicopter, was put to the test in a variety of missions, from medical evacuations to tactical control to frontline cargo support. 5 years later, in 1956, the British Royal Marines 4-5 Commando Battalion executed the first combat helicopter insertion with air assault. During an amphibious landing as a part of Operation Musketeer during the Suez Crisis, 10 Westland Whirlwind Mark IIs delivered 23 tons of equipment and 650 Marines. As early as 1961, the United States Army was sending CH-2 transport helicopters to the South Vietnamese troops. Operation Chopper begins on December 23, 1961. Initially, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam successfully utilized the helicopters, but soon the Viet Cong developed strong counter-helicopter attack strategies. And by January, 13 of 15 have been hit by enemy fire and 4 have been shot down completely. Even after April of 1962, when the United States begins sending Marine helicopter squadrons to aid the ARVN forces, Viet Cong fighters proved tenacious. And during 1964's Operation Sure Wind, 17 out of 21 helicopters are hit, and 3 of them are shot down. Back in the United States, the U.S. House of Representatives Minority Leader, Gerald Ford, gives an address to the National Press Club in which he let communist rulers and the American people know that the U.S. is working with and for the people of South Vietnam, and we will not bow to any communist forces.
The communist leaders in Moscow, Peking, and Hanoi must fully understand that the United States considers the freedom of South Vietnam vital to our interests, and they must know that we are not bluffing in our determination to defend those interests.
Many elected officials like Ford espouse a clear goal of victory over communist forces through American ingenuity and the physical and technological strength of its military. In reality, the problem of how to win a war in Vietnam, especially on an unfamiliar battlefield that is mostly harsh jungle terrain, raises a host of doubts in the United States military's true capabilities. At Fort Benning, Georgia, in February of 1963, the United States Army begins to experiment with combining light infantry with helicopter support. The 11th Air Assault Division's training exercises result in some disagreement about the tactical success of the unit. But even at the caution of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara pushes the unit forward under the counterinsurgency doctrine recently established by the Pentagon. As a result, the 11th Air Assault Division is merged with the 2nd Infantry Division and redesignated the 1st Air Cavalry Division. On November 14, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore leads one unit of the 1st Air Cavalry into the first large-scale helicopter assault, not only of the Vietnam War, but in U.S. military history. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, carries with them a tradition of excellence and leadership, but its history is also a burden of bad omens. General George Custer himself led the 7th Cavalry into battle in June of 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Would the 1st Battalion emerge as the first successful air cavalry landing and assault mission? Or would they be doomed to repeat history? Army specialist Jack P. Smith, who would later go on to work as an Emmy-winning news correspondent, recalled the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in a 2003 speech given to fellow veterans of the battle.
It is November 1965, the Ia Drang Valley. The nearest town, Pleiku, a remote Vietnamese province capital, and west of town, beyond the stilted long huts of the Montagnards, flat scrub jungle cover the hills by the Cambodian border, a smuggler's haven, and now the infiltration route for the first North Vietnamese regulars to invade South Vietnam. American regular infantry, the first sent to Vietnam as the war escalates, have come to this border country to hunt the People's Army of Vietnam. They are the men of the 1st Air Cav, the 1st Army Infantry Division to ride into war in helicopters. The leading unit is Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment. Driving their choppers into a landing zone designated X-Ray, a few miles from the Cambodian border, on the 14th of November 1965, they land on top of a North Vietnamese Army base, A ferocious battle ensues that lasts 3 whole days. Hal Moore's battalion several times comes within inches of being overrun. In the end, reinforced to brigade strength, the U.S. troops destroy the better part of a North Vietnamese division at X-Ray. 79 Americans are killed, 121 wounded, a total of 200 U.S. casualties, the highest toll of the war till then. But there are roughly 2,000 North Vietnamese casualties. I came in on the last day of the battle. I remember the NVA bodies were piled so thick around the foxholes you could walk on them for 100 feet in some places. The American GIs were the same color as the dirt, and all had that 1,000-yard stare of those newly initiated to combat. The next day, after a restless night, my battalion, 2-7, walked away from X-Ray toward another clearing called LZ Albany. Around lunchtime, we were jumped by a North Vietnamese formation. Like us, about 500 strong. Fighting was hand-to-hand. I was lying so close to a North Vietnamese machine gunner that I simply stuck out my rifle and blew off his head. It was, I think, the only time during the war that a U.S. battalion was ever overrun. The U.S. casualties for this 4th day of battle, 155 killed, 121 wounded. More dead than wounded. The North Vietnamese suffered a couple of hundred casualties. The fight at LZ Albany was largely overlooked as an aberration. Poor leadership, green troops. In this first encounter between their main force regulars, the two sides focused instead on X-Ray. Interestingly, both drew the same conclusion, that each could win using the tactics of attrition.
2 days and nights of intense battle, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry digs in at location X-Ray and manages to repel their North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attackers. 1 day after the Battle of Ia Drang, however, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry is unable to escape an attack from the North Vietnamese near location Albany. This attack remains the most successful ambush of United States forces throughout the Vietnam War. While the outcome of that ambush is clear, the Battle of Ia Drang sees both sides claiming victory. The North Vietnamese wildly overestimates United States losses at 1,500 to 1,700, when the number was in fact just over 200. And the United States reported over 1,000 North Vietnamese killed, while the number is closer to 600. The question of victory remains unanswered, but the battle still stands as the first successful air assault by U.S. cavalry, and indeed the first proper battle between the North Vietnamese and the United States Army. Ia Drang can even be seen as a kind of trial by fire for the use of tactics by both sides in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese learn that engaging the Americans swiftly and at close range gives them an advantage, while the United States Army now had a successful air assault under their belt, meeting their goals on the battlefield through air mobility, artillery fire, and close air support. Commanding officer for the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Harold Hal Moore, who receives the Distinguished Service Cross for his unwavering courage and leadership by example during the action at location X-Ray, presents the challenges faced by the Air Cavalry in his after-action report. After-action report, Ia Drang Valley Operation 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 14 through 16, November 1965. Commanding Officer, 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. Due to last-minute positioning of the artillery pieces caused by air movement delays, the preparatory fires did not begin until 10:17 hours. I was in the lead aircraft and had a good view of these fires. They were precisely where required and beautifully timed with the landing of lead elements of the assault company. Fires were concentrated principally around the landing zone, in the trees and high grass, and on a finger and in a draw leading down from the high ground northwest of X-Ray. The aerial artillery came in on the heels of the tube artillery fires and worked over the area for 30 seconds, expending half their loads, then went on into a nearby air orbit on call. The lift battalion gunships took up the fires and were immediately ahead of the UH-1Ds. As we came in for the assault landing, all door gunners fired into the trees and high grass. We landed and ran from the landing zone into the trees, firing our M16s at likely enemy positions. On the ground, we received no enemy fire and made no contact upon landing. The terrain was flat and consisted of scrub trees up to 100 feet high, thick elephant grass varying in height from 1 foot to 5 feet, and anthills throughout the area, up to 8 feet high, with thick brush and elephant grass on and around them. Along the western edge of the LZ, the trees and grass were especially thick and extended off into the jungle on the foothills of the mountain. At approximately 11:20 hours, one of the recon squads took a prisoner. I immediately took my S2 and the Vietnamese, Mr. Nick, and went to the location and questioned him. He was unarmed, dressed in dirty khaki shirt and trousers, with a serial number on one of the shirt epaulets, and carried an empty canteen. He stated that he had eaten only bananas for 5 days, and that there were 3 battalions on the mountain above us who wanted very much to kill Americans, but had been unable to find them. He stated that he was in the North Vietnamese Army. Around 12:45 hours, lead elements of Company B began to engage in a firefight of moderate intensity. Shortly afterwards, at approximately 13:30 hours, Commanding Officer Company B reported that he was being attacked heavily by at least 2 companies of enemy and that his right platoon was in danger of being surrounded and cut off from the rest of the company by numerically superior force. The firefight became intense. Also, a few rounds of 60 and 81 millimeter mortar fire began falling in the LZ and on B Company. B Company also received some rocket fire. By 17:40 hours, I decided that it was necessary to pull A and B companies, under cover of heavy supporting fires, back to the fringe of the landing zone and set up a tight defensive perimeter for the night. We were still in good communications with the surrounded platoon, and it was ringed with close-in artillery defensive fire. My intentions were to conduct another coordinated attack during the night or early the next morning to reach it, or to get them out during the night by infiltration. Joseph Galloway, a journalist who served 4 tours in Vietnam, and is the only civilian decorated with the Bronze Star Medal for valor during that war, remarks later that if nothing else, Ia Drang was the battle that convinced Ho Chi Minh that the United States could win. As the Air Cavalry made revolutionary use of helicopters and air support during the Vietnam War, the technology ultimately proves inefficient to win against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. In this memo to President Johnson, sent shortly after the Battle of Ia Drang from U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, says that the successful tactics employed by the Air Cav only seem to inspire enemy forces to step up their tactics and abilities and relentlessly pursue their goal of victory over the Americans.
The dramatic recent changes in the situation are on the military side. They are the increased infiltration from the north and the increased willingness of the communist forces to stand and fight, even in large-scale engagements. The Ia Drang River campaign of early November is an example. Communist casualties and desertions can be expected to go up if my recommendations for increased U.S., South Vietnamese, and third-party forces are accepted. Nevertheless, the enemy can be expected to enlarge his present strength of 110 battalion equivalents to more than 150 battalion equivalents by the end of calendar 1966, when hopefully his losses can be made to equal his input.
Some United States cavalrymen in the Vietnam War carry on the traditions of cavalry warfare from over 100 years prior. The United States Regiment of Dragoons was first organized on March 2, 1833. When the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons was raised 3 years later, the original regiment becomes the 1st Regiment of Dragoons, a nickname that the 1st Cavalry Regiment still uses to this present day. The 1st Regiment of Dragoons serves from initial frontier duty throughout the Civil War through World War II. In 1951, the 1st Cavalry Regiment is created, essentially a reactivation of the 1st Regiment of Dragoons. In 1967, the 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, is deployed to Vietnam. The unit initially consists of 3 armored cavalry troops and 1 air cavalry troop, D Troop, which does not deploy until the following year. 1st Cavalry Regiment serves alongside the American Division, as well as the 101st Airborne in such locales as Chu Lai, Da Nang, and Tam Kỳ. D Troop, the Air Cavalry Troop, would remain on active combat duty throughout the last 4 years of the Vietnam War. While tanks and armored cavalry are utilized in Vietnam, it is ultimately the air cavalry tactics that mature during that conflict. As the war in Vietnam ends with the withdrawal of United States and other Allied forces, the United States Cavalry now possesses new knowledge, tactics, and capabilities for future use. In Vietnam, regiments such as the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment consisted of a headquarters troop, 3 cavalry troops, an aviation troop consisting of UH-1 transports, OH-6 Cayuse Scouts, OH-58 Kiowa Scout gunships, and AH-1 Cobra gunships. Rounding out the regiment are a tank company and a 150mm self-propelled howitzer battery. The ground troops are equipped with M48 Patton tanks and M113 armored cavalry assault vehicles. It is the mission of the tank companies to close in on the enemy with firepower once the cavalry reconnaissance troops have found and held the enemy combatants. The tanks were then to outmaneuver and destroy the enemy with shock tactics. As the war continues, in 1969, the United States began to equip most cavalry units with the upgraded M551 Sheridan and the M3 Bradley Cavalry fighting vehicles, the latter of which are used in hunter-killer missions, where cavalry scouts in the Bradley vehicles, hunters, will seek out enemy positions, drive the enemy into a kill zone, where the armored units or killers await in Patton and Sheridan tanks. Today, the 1st Brigade Combat Team, 1st Cavalry Division, is nicknamed the Iron Horse and is comprised of, among others, units from the 7th, 5th, 8th, and 12th Cavalry. The Iron Horses they use now have been in development since the 1st Combat Team was constituted in August 1917. Since World War I, tanks evolved with ever-changing technology. By 1980, the U.S. military is looking to replace its M60 Patton tanks, and they find what they're looking for in the M1 Abrams tank. Developed from 1972 through 1979, the 3rd-generation main battle tank is named for General Creighton Abrams, commander of the U.S. military forces in Vietnam and former Army Chief of Staff. Crewed by a team of 4 men, a commander, a driver, a gunner, and a loader, the M1A1 tank boasts a 120mm smooth-bore gun with 40 rounds, a 50 caliber M2HB heavy machine gun with 900 rounds, and 2 7.62mm M240 machine guns with 10,400 rounds. The Abrams M1A1 weighs in at 63 short tons and is reinforced with Burlington composite armor composed of top-secret materials that withstand high-explosive anti-tank rounds and other shaped charges. Often partnered with the Abrams on the battlefield is the M3 Bradley Cavalry fighting vehicle. Initially designed to support the M113 armored personnel carrier, the Bradley has ended up replacing them altogether. The reconnaissance vehicle is armored with steel and aluminum and is crewed by 3 men, but can seat up to 5. Its main armaments are 25mm M242 chain gun with 1,500 rounds, dual tow anti-tank missile launcher with 12 rounds, and a 7.62 M240C machine gun. In the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Bradleys and their powerful 25mm cannon and tow anti-tank missile combination destroys more enemy tanks than the M1 Abrams. The Persian Gulf War began with an extensive air campaign on January 1991. Coalition forces from 34 countries rallied together to oppose the aggression on the part of Iraq and its president, Saddam Hussein. In retaliation for Hussein's invasion of a neighboring country and vast bastion of oil, Kuwait, the coalition forces dropped over 88,000 tons of bombs, with the goal to destroy Iraq's air force and anti-aircraft capabilities. The Center for Military History describes the initial ground maneuvers by coalition forces, including United States mechanized and armored cavalry units. On 24 February, when ground operations started in earnest, coalition forces were poised along a line that stretched from the Persian Gulf westward 300 miles into the desert. The 18th Airborne Corps, under Lieutenant General Gary E. Luck, held the left, or western flank, and consisted of the 82nd Airborne Division, the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault, the 24th Infantry Division, mechanized, the French 6th Light Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Cavalry, and the 12th and 18th Aviation Brigades. The 7th Corps, under Lieutenant General Frederick M. Franks, Jr., was deployed to the right of the 18th Airborne Corps and consisted of the 1st Infantry Division, mechanized, the 1st Cavalry Division, armored, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, the British 1st Armored Division, the 2nd Armored Cavalry, and the 11th Aviation Brigade. Between them, these two corps covered about two-thirds of the line occupied by the huge multinational force. After 38 days of continuous air attacks on targets in Iraq and Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush directed Central Command to proceed with the ground offensive. General Schwarzkopf unleashed all-out attacks against Iraqi forces very early on 24 February at 3 points along the Allied line. In the far west, the French 6th Light Armored and the 101st Airborne Divisions started the massive western envelopment with a ground assault to secure the Allied left flank and an air assault to establish forward support bases deep in Iraqi territory. In the approximate center of the Allied line, along the Wadi al-Batin, Major General John H. Tillelly Jr.'s 1st Cavalry Division attacked north into a concentration of Iraqi divisions, whose commanders remained convinced that the coalition would use that and several other wadis, or ravines, as avenues of attack. In the east, 2 Marine divisions, with the Army's Tiger Brigade, and coalition forces under Saudi command, attacked north into Kuwait. Faced with major attacks from 3 widely separated points, the Iraqi command had to begin its ground defense of Kuwait and the homeland by dispersing its combat power and logistical capability. As the M1 Abrams tanks moved into battle along with British Challenger 1 and Kuwaiti M84AB tanks to their side, it quickly becomes clear that Iraq's tank technology cannot compete with coalition forces. For the first time, GPS is used by coalition forces for navigation, turning the battle into one of maneuver rather than a battle of encounter. The GPS allowed coalition fighters to move without need for maps, fixed landmarks, or even roads, and superior air support helped coalition forces drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. In 2003, when the United States military returned to Iraq for Operation Iraqi Freedom, the M1A1 Abrams tanks and Bradley CFVs were still rolling onto the battlefield. In addition to superior mechanized reconnaissance vehicles and tanks, the United States Air Mobile Cavalry today uses a variety of attack helicopters, as the Center for Military History relates. The experience of Vietnam showed that the existing attack helicopter, the AH-1 Cobra, was vulnerable even to light anti-aircraft fire and lacked the agility to fly close to the ground for long periods of time. The AH-56A Cheyenne helicopter, canceled in 1969, had been intended to correct those deficiencies. The new attack helicopter program, announced in August 1972, drew from the combat experience of the Cobra and the developmental experience of the Cheyenne to specify an aircraft that could absorb battle damage and had the power for rapid movement and heavy loads. The helicopter would have to be able to fly the nap of the earth and maneuver with great agility to succeed in a new anti-tank mission on a high-intensity battlefield. The first prototypes of the AH-64A Apache attack helicopter flew in September 1975, and in December 1976, the Army selected the Hughes YAM-64 for production. Sophisticated night vision and target sensing devices allowed the pilot to fly the nap of the Earth even at night. The aircraft's main weapon was the Hellfire, helicopter launched fire and forget missile, 16 of which could be carried in 4 launchers. In place of the anti-tank missile, the Apache could carry 76 70mm 2.75-inch Hydra 70 folding fin rockets. It could also mount a combination of 8 Hellfire missiles and 38 rockets. In the nose, the aircraft mounted a Hughes 30mm single-barrel chain gun. Full-scale production began in 1982, and the Army received the first aircraft in December 1983. As of the end of 1990, the McDonnell Douglas Helicopter Company, which purchased Hughes in 1984, had delivered 629 Apaches, which equipped 19 active attack helicopter battalions. When production was completed, the Apaches were intended to equip 26 regular Army, 2 Reserve, and 12 National Guard battalions, a total of 807 aircraft. Faster and quieter than the UH-1, the UH-60A Black Hawk helicopter can lift an entire infantry squad or a 105mm howitzer with ammunition. Widely in use by Air Cav and the 101st Airborne during Operation Desert Storm, suffering minimal casualties. Although the 101st suffered no combat deaths during the 4-day ground war, the attached 2nd Battalion, 229th Aviation, was less fortunate. 5 soldiers were killed when hostile fire brought down their Black Hawk helicopter, which was on a combat search and rescue mission to recover an Air Force pilot. Iraqi forces captured 3 members of the Black Hawk crew and released them soon after the war. Flown by 2 pilots, with 2 more chiefs or gunners, the Black Hawk could carry up to 11 troops or 6 stretchers for medevac use. Arming the helicopter are 2 7.62mm M240 machine guns with either 2 more 7.62mm M134 Minions or 2 50 caliber GAU-19 Gatling guns. Different variants of the Black Hawk are also armed with Hydra 70mm rockets, AGM-114 Hellfire laser-guided missiles, or M230 gun pods of varying calibers. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Fife recalls his time as part of Task Force 118 in the Gulf War. Fife describes being a part of a crew on board a Kiowa Warrior reconnaissance helicopter.
Tonight the moon did not rise in the North Persian Gulf. No stars could be seen through the dense layer of fog and dust. The horizon was barely visible through ANVA's 6 goggles of the flight leader. The air crews of the U.S. Army Aviation Detachment aboard the Mobile Sea Base had never seen such a condition of total darkness and meteorological obscuration. The only lights visible were from the gas-oil separators of offshore rigs. The nearest land was nearly 100 miles to the west. As would become the pattern of operations in future months, the flight crews conducted a flight briefing at precisely 1830. Scheduled takeoff would be after midnight. After pre-flight, the team relaxed in the 6-man room below the hangar and flight deck. Without warning, the oral warning sounded. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. Iranian gunboats inbound. Quickly the air crews put on second chance vests and 9mm pistols and ran down the hall and up the stairwell to the flight deck. As the pilots and crewmen ascended the steps, loud cannon shots could be heard in the distance at nearly 1 per second. Little time was lost finding seats and responsibilities, as this had been already briefed. As the pilots found their aircraft and positions, the flight team was already pushing the 275 rockets into place and arming the 50 caliber machine gun. The aircraft were cranked and running within minutes. The launch order had already been given prior to crank. As flight leads' radios were brought online, internal commo checks were completed. Left-seaters immediately typed navigational alignment data into onboard computers to bring the system online and powered the thermal imaging site. Right-seaters rolled their throttles to full operating RPM and turned on all weapons systems. Flight lead initiated the call to the FFG that would control the launch and vector to target. A ceasefire order was given aboard the FFG, and the Warrior flight departed the deck 50 feet above the smooth waters of the northern Persian Gulf. Immediately after leaving the deck, the two AH-58D aircraft joined in formation and proceeded on their initial vector to the northeast. They were ordered to arm and fire at any hostile vessel in the target area. Only seconds into the flight, it was apparent how bad the visibility and flight conditions were. The Army aviators aboard the aircraft realized that for perhaps the first time in their careers, they would really earn their pay.
Any branch of the United States military will have customs and traditions unique to that particular branch. The United States Cavalry is no exception. In the 1st 7th Cavalry, the Order of the Spur is a tradition that dates back to the days when cavalry rode and fought on horseback.
Know ye that, with carbine and Colt in hand, having followed the guidon to the very frontier of the free world, and having demonstrated the skill, fitness, dash, and cunning of a United States cavalry trooper, defeating his enemy in the sands of northern Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and is hereby entered into the rolls of the Order of the Spur, and is hereby awarded the Combat Spurs. Given this, the 10th day of October, 2001.
The Order of the Spur is to recognize individual qualifications for those in a cavalry unit. The privilege of being awarded spurs in the U.S. Cavalry comes with hard work. 2 years must be served in the cavalry, and you must be certified by your branch or military occupational specialty qualification school. A spur ride is led by spur-qualified non-commissioned officers and is supervised by the Squadron Command Sergeant Major. Officers generally conduct their own spur ride along similar lines. Traditionally, it starts at the break of day with group PT or a PT test. Individuals and their equipment are inspected, and a thorough hazing of candidates begins. During the course of the day, candidates are subjected to different stations that test their initiative, military expertise, and stamina. As night approaches, the candidates are assembled and provided with instructions. From there, the candidates must negotiate a general route from station to station where, again, their skills and tenacity are tested. Their route is designed to take them over a 25-mile course in the dead of night. During the course of the night, and usually into the morning, candidates negotiate the course and, eventually, arrive at the finish line. All the while, points are issued, and cavalry soldiers are graded on marksmanship, physical fitness, and a written cavalry thesis with bibliography. Perhaps one of the most iconic cavalry hallmarks is the Stetson hat. In the mid-1960s, Lieutenant Colonel John Stockton began the tradition of modern cavalrymen sporting Stetsons, modeled after the cavalry hats worn on the frontier by the likes of General George Custer and many other cavalry troopers of the late 19th century. Stockton's goal was to instill in cavalrymen a new esprit de corps, and it worked. Air Cav troopers wore the hat in Vietnam, and the private purchase item is a point of pride, even today. In 2011, the United States Army issued a statement that all Army headgear would be replaced with the Stetson hat, just in time for April Fool's Day. Washington, April 1st, 2011. In a fingertip-to-the-brim nod to its American frontier history, the Army is changing hats again, returning to the tumultuous days of the horse cavalry in the Wild West and adopting a dark blue Stetson as the official headgear for the current force of 1.1 million soldiers. "We figure the Stetson will be popular with the troops," said Sergeant Major Bob S. Stone, Army Uniform Board Headgear Task Force President. "It's been a while since we have changed the headgear, so it's time. Plus, a Stetson is functional and downright American." But reminiscent of the controversial switch from the garrison cap to the black beret, the Army faces opposition from one community deeply opposed to losing its special identity with the Stetson, the armor branch. "Why in the heck are they doing to us what they did to the snake eaters?" asked one officer familiar with the board's deliberations. "If you ain't Cav, you ain't ought to be wearing a Cav hat. That just ain't right." First appearing in print in a cavalry journal from 1923, Fiddler's Green is a poem that purports to have been passed on from various sources within the cavalry, dating back to the 1800s. The poem envisions an afterlife for the cavalrymen that is just as hard as the life they live in combat, serving their country. "Halfway down the trail to hell, in a shady meadow green, are the souls of all dead troopers camped near a good old-time canteen. And this eternal resting place is known as Fiddler's Green. Marching past, straight through to hell, the infantry are seen, accompanied by the engineers, artillery, and marines. But none but the shades of cavalrymen dismount at Fiddler's Green." On July 28, 1866, the 7th Cavalry was born. One of the most storied regiments of the cavalry, their nickname, Gary Owen, comes from an old Irish drinking song that they had adopted as a march tune. "We are the pride of the Army and a regiment of great renown. Our names on the pages of history from 66 on down. If you think we stop or falter while into the fray we're going, just watch the step with our heads erect when our band plays Gary Owen." Cavalry tradition has it that when a new wife came to the first hail and farewell, she was welcomed into the Order of the Yellow Rose by the most junior officer or non-commissioned officer. This trooper would welcome each wife by presenting her with a yellow rose and a kiss on her cheek for good luck at her new post. Today, this tradition is known as the Order of the Yellow Garter, and wives and girlfriends of cavalrymen are encouraged to wear a yellow garter when attending cavalry functions, or if the cavalryman is deployed in combat. While the United States Cavalry is steeped in traditions, some dating back nearly 2 centuries, its ability to evolve with ever-changing technological advances has been one of the cavalry's greatest strengths. The harsh lessons of Vietnam ultimately led the United States Cavalry to develop their strongest strategies yet, those for the sky. The air mobile capabilities and developments in Air Cavalry have been in place since Vietnam and remain in use today as the United States military battles terrorism around the goal. Today, Much of the equipment and the uniform of the United States Cavalry would be unrecognizable to the cavalrymen of the 18th and 19th century. But the traditions, teachings, and tactics are timeless. From Custer's last stand to the War on Terror, the United States Cavalry continues to serve proudly. From the horse to the automobile to the tank, up to the helicopter, cavalry warfare has been revolutionized by the United States, and these advances continue. A detachment of horse-mounted cavalry still remains, used for ceremonial purposes, a symbol that for as far forward as the United States Cavalry has come, their customs, traditions, tragedies, and triumphs will never be forgotten.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.